screams in the night. Indian legends. Miles of footprints. Sightings. What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Join us for eyewitness accounts, questions and answers, Bigfoot encounters of the past, and ongoing encounters in the present. Your host, two-time witness, field researcher for 43 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello, everyone. We're really privileged to have Bill Munns join us again. So I guess we can do sort of a part two. Bill, Tom, Brian, how are you today?
Very good, thank you, sir.
Very good.
Well, Brian, I know you've got a bunch of questions. We'll let you kick things off.
Sure. So Bill, again, thank you for coming on. One of the things I was always interested in learning about is about how you were able to, in kind of the recreation, to learn about the creature's height. In other words, I think you said that Patty was about 7'4" between, I think 7'4" and 7'6" or something like that. And I was just curious as to how you were able to determine that.
Well, actually, at the moment, that issue is still undetermined. Early in my involvement in the film, I started exploring an idea of using a classic optical formula which compares the distance a subject is from the center of a lens, the distance from the center of the lens to the film plane behind it where the picture is taken, the height of the actual subject being photographed compared to the height of the subject as it appears on the film. This simple formula allows you to calculate one of those four variables if you know the other three. So I was applying that originally back in 2008, 2009. And when I did it, based on the size of Patty as she appears, like in the frame 254, the famous look-back frame, and a 25 millimeter lens, which is what was presumed to be on the camera, and the distance from lens to where Patty was, based on a lot of research that other researchers had done, I added that up and crunched the numbers, and I came up with a height of only about 4'10" tall, which
right.
Frankly didn't make a whole lot of sense.
Exactly.
So I started exploring the idea that we can't change how big she is on the film. That's an absolute. That's for certain. And her distance from camera is pretty well documented by several people. So I questioned whether or not it's possible that a shorter focal length lens could change the calculation. So for a while I was exploring a 15 millimeter lens on the camera instead of a 25. And it was the 15 millimeter lens that gave that calculation that she was around 7'2", 7'4", something like that. Unfortunately, after I announced that and presented that information, I was able to get more research material, particularly some footage that John Green filmed Jim McLaren the following June at Bluff Creek, trying to walk a path similar to what Patty did so that you could compare his walk to hers. Well, John Green's lens on his camera is almost identical to the lens on Roger's camera. So if Roger had a 15 millimeter, then John Green had to have 15 or maybe at the most a 16 millimeter lens. Well, we know where John Green's camera was, and we know where a lot of debris is that they walk behind. And with a 15 or 16 millimeter lens on Green's camera, that would have put Jim McLaren in front of this debris that we know he's walking behind. So at that point, basically, the idea of a 15 millimeter lens had to be abandoned completely. There is still some research on the idea of a 20 millimeter lens, which puts Patty far enough away that she would clear the debris, and actually puts Jim McLaren on a path based on his height, which is known, almost identical to where we assume that Patty is, which is interesting. But there is still a lot of evidence based on the survey of the site suggesting a 25 millimeter lens. So this whole question of her height as determined by the lens on the camera is still in the process of being resolved. The simple reality is we've got a tremendous amount of data, but some of the data supports a 25 millimeter lens, some supports a 20, and it can't be both. So there's an error in the data somewhere. So what we're having to do is literally review every bit of data to try to find the error. And it's kind of slow going, and we aren't quite there yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know in your book, because I know that when you were at LA Valley College, you said that you were using 35 millimeter, but just for our audience, can you break down what the difference is between, like, for example, a 16 millimeter and a 35 millimeter?
Yeah, the millimeter refers to the width of the film.
Mm-hmm.
So 35 millimeter film actually is 35 millimeters wide side to side. And 16 millimeter film is actually 16 millimeters side to side. So that's how the designation comes about. With 35 millimeter, the camera equipment's a lot more sophisticated, and there are nobody uses a wind camera like they do on 16. And we don't have magazine-type cameras that have a preloaded film that was actually loaded by the manufacturer, Kodak, that you just drop it into the camera and start shooting. You don't have that on a 35 millimeter film. In that, a camera operator or a camera assistant is always one who has to load the film into the magazine in a very precise way. And then when you put the magazine on the camera, you have to be very, very careful on how you set it into the camera so that it goes into the film gate, and there's a little loop before and after, so that when the gate is pulling the film down for an intermittent movement, the magazine feed, which is a continuous movement, never gets grabbed or pinched or torn or something. So there's quite a bit of difference technically in how you work with a 35 millimeter and a 16. Now, the Patterson film was definitely shot with a 16 millimeter camera. So the technology that we always apply to when we're doing analysis is the technology of how 16 millimeter cameras work.
Mm-hmm. And I know that also, just in terms of, well, actually I have a couple more questions about audio. I mean, do you know, was there, in the Patterson film, all we have is the video. Do you know if there was any, like, audio recording along with that maybe got lost in the process, or?
No. In 16 millimeter, the only camera that can record audio as well as take film was a camera called an Oricon. News photographers and news reporters often used it at the time. They'd send a reporter out with a camera, had a microphone on it, and they'd do the interview with somebody and such. And then all they'd have to do is go back to the studio, run the film through the lab, process it, and they've got a film ready to show with sync audio on it. Because the Oricon camera would actually mark the side of the 16 millimeter film with an optical audio track. But now that's the only camera that did that. Now, Roger used a camera called a Kodak K100. It has no capacity for sound whatsoever. In fact, almost every 16 millimeter camera made had no capacity for sound. The Oricon was the one exception to it. So, no, there was no sound being recorded at Bluff Creek that day.
And another question I had, because I know that you talk about this in the book, but in one of the very first documentaries, you talk about how, I don't know if it was, I guess there was a mistake where they flipped the frame of the beginning of the film. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Not quite clear on what you mean. Could you elaborate a bit?
No, because I guess in one of the early documentaries, in the early portion of the film, Patty was moving right to left, and then, but it wasn't actually accurate though. She was moving left to right. So, But
that particular
yeah,
that happened because somebody in the lab making a documentary flipped the film.
right.
That's
Yeah,
all.
and that was yeah, that was kind of a big mistake at the time because people said, "Oh, well, this is evidence that it's a fake and everything," but
Yeah, I know. It caused a lot of problems. People don't realize that as a film editor, that's actually not an uncommon occurrence. There are occasional times when a film editor feels that the film will flow more smoothly if they flip the film, and there are occasional times if a film editor's been working long, hard hours and they're getting a little punchy and they're really not paying attention, that they may accidentally flip the film. So it can happen either way. It's not a big deal, really. In other words, a film editor wouldn't be the slightest bit surprised. They just say, okay, it happens, big deal. The problem is a lot of these skeptic people who don't understand anything about film built that up into some epic conspiracy of some kind when it was just a simple mistake.
yeah.
It's just human frailty on the part of the editor.
Yeah, one of the things that I want the listeners to understand too is that you had a lot of experience. In one of the colleges that you went to, there was the Phase 1 course where you looked and actually handled different animals like chimps, elephants, lions, tigers, jaguars, bears, emus, etc. And then you went to Phase 2 and then Phase 3 as an animal trainer. So
Right.
your expertise is very extensive, and that's one of the reasons why you're a great analyst of the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Yeah. What you're referring to is an animal training program that was offered by a famous Hollywood animal compound called Gentle Jungle. It was owned and operated by a very famous animal trainer named Ralph Helfer. And yeah, it had 3 phases, and it actually trained you to work with, handle, care for, and ultimately train exotic animals. It was quite an extraordinary program. And in doing so, it put me very, very close to animals that most people never get to, especially like chimps and orangutans. And in doing so, it allowed me to have a much better understanding of primate anatomy than the average person has. When you actually get one-on-one close to an animal like that, where you can actually physically touch it, it can touch you, and such, you can inspect its anatomy with far greater detail, and when you observe its behaviors. And that is...
Hello?
Did we lose him?
Yeah, what happened?
I don't know. Bill, are you there? Uh-oh.
Okay, maybe you can recall him, perhaps. Or...
Yeah, let me pause the recording. Brian, go right ahead and I guess ask your question again.
Well, I think we were just talking about the different phases of Bill's education and so forth, and handling animals and so forth. Is that where we left off at, I think?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Did you want me to go through a brief reply again?
Will, do you have the...
Or, yeah, I don't know how much of that you got.
Let's. Would it be okay with you, Bill, to just kind of go through the whole thing again? I hate to say it, and then Will, is that okay?
No problem for me.
Yeah, we can edit it.
Okay, no problem for me. Okay, the program you're referring to is one that was offered by an Hollywood animal rental company called Gentle Jungle, owned and operated by a very famous animal trainer named Ralph Helfer. They actually did train people in handling, caring for, and even training various types of exotic animals. And during the course of that program, which I took back in 1980, it put me in close quarters or close contact with chimpanzees and orangutans in particular, aside from the other exotics. And that gave me an awareness and understanding of primate anatomy in a real up-close, personal kind of way that the average person doesn't have. And so when it came down to analyzing the Patterson film, and is it a person with a fur costume and a mask, or is it a real primate, having that up-close personal knowledge of real primate anatomy proved to be tremendously helpful to me.
And, Bill, another question on that is that in your book you talk about how the back of Patty's neck fur did not compare to anything that you would see in a costume at that time, correct?
Right. Yes.
And what were the differences between? That.
Okay. You have to understand that with the type of fur used for ape suits, it changed radically around 1984, 1985, when stretch spandex-based furs were introduced to the costume industry and subsequently used on ape suits. The stretch spandex costumes stretch very much like skin does. They're really quite remarkable. But the Patterson film was made in 1967. So when we look at it, we have to analyze it based on what we know about fur cloth and fur materials that were available in 1967. And basically, the artificial furs made at that time were almost like carpet. They had a very, very heavy, non-elastic base or backing, and then they had the individual hairs tied into that base or backing, very much like a shag carpet. If you used real taxidermied fur and hide of a real animal, like bear skin that was used on the 1976 King Kong, still, when the leather's processed, it doesn't have any real stretch or elasticity. It's pretty stiff material. So it can bend or flex, but it cannot really stretch in any direction. So when we're dealing with a fur cloth suit, and you have the head going down through the neck attaching to the torso, the problem is if you want your head to be able to turn in any direction like a head normally and comfortably does, all of those motions are fighting constantly a fur cloth that would go from the head to the neck to the torso. If you tailor the fur cloth exactly to the size and contour of the body at rest, you'll hardly be able to turn the head at all. So various processes have been used to try to cheat it. One of them is to not even connect the head fur to the torso fur, just leave the two separate so the head can move around freely. But if you do that and you're looking at it from the back, sooner or later you're going to see a big gap appear between the head and the torso fur pieces. Now, other things that were tried and were widely used back then is they'd build the shoulders up much higher, and then they'd take the fur cloth from the head down into the neck and tuck it way down further into the costume, and they'd leave it loose. So it actually had some ugly little ripples in it like a cloth fold. But because you got these big built-up shoulders, most people didn't notice it. It was a simple cheat. But we don't see that on Patty. We don't see the line in the back. There's a disconnection of the head at the neck or torso fur. And we don't see any raised up shoulder that the head sits down in between to hide the folding of the fur cloth. And the odd thing is, we're looking at the back of Patty's neck for most of the film. I'd say about 95% of the film, we're looking at the back of her neck. And it's always absolutely flawless. Even after she turns her head all the way around to literally look over her shoulder back at Roger's camera. Now, in the old days, if you had a fur costume and an actor turned his head that far and then looked back away and you're still looking at the back of the neck, you'd see some kind of a mess or a disruption of the fur. I've built enough fur costumes that I know every time that happens, when they call a cut, you got to run out on the set, you got to brush the hair down behind the neck. in order to try to blend it back in, and you almost never photograph the costume from the back. So Roger was doing something that basically nobody building a costume and trying to maintain it on set would have done in 1967.
Right, and also we don't see a zipper anywhere. During those days, if somebody was wearing a costume, where would the zipper be? Right in the back?
Well, you had two possibilities. One's the normal zipper down the back, and I have done that. The other possibility, though, is to make the back seamless and build the costume as a pair of shirt and pants, and they join at the waist. Stuart Freeborn did that on the 2001 Ape sequence in the Dawn of Man of 2001.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of people think that if you put the zipper up the back, and the fur just lays down straight to each side of it, that it'll be obvious. But when I did that for a parody of the 2001 Apes for a computer commercial back in 1987, what I did was I built the suit with the zipper up the back. It worked just fine. But then the fur material itself was actually cut in a zigzag kind of a pattern so that you would have a big triangular square about 3 inches on each side that would go over the zipper on one side, and then another triangle that would go over the zipper on the other side, and then the left side, the right side, the left side, the right side. So it was literally a zigzag pattern. When we tightened that all up and brushed all the hair out, you could not see a zipper, no matter how close you are. If you were a foot away, you would not see a zipper. It was a perfect blend of it. So there are ways of hiding the zipper up the back. I'm not familiar with some of the older costumes of the 30s or 40s, whether or not they might have used that technique. It's certainly possible. But anyways, you have the two possibilities. One's put the zipper down the back. It's a one-piece jumpsuit the person climbs into, they zip him up. Or you can do it as pants and shirt, and you join them at the waist. Those have been the two options.
Bill, even so, if that had been employed on Patty, still wouldn't account for the muscle movement. Like you said, the flexible skin surface and all that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely not. There's a lot of people just seem to, let me clear up one thing about the muscle thing. We can build a costume that looks like it has very impressive muscles. That's not a problem. You can actually sculpt an understructure that has all of the muscles wonderfully defined, and then you can actually tailor a costume to match all of those contours of a muscle perfectly. So if you wanted a fur costume with a massive sense of musculature, you can make it. That's no big deal. It could have been made then. But as soon as you want the muscles to move in any way, the costume will fail, because the padding has no capacity to move the way muscles move. Simply can't. What could not be done at that time, it's still nearly impossible now. A lot of people have tried it and worked on it, and no one's ever really done successfully, even with new technology. But in the good old days, no, absolutely not. You would not see anything in the body that would have any resemblance to natural muscle movement. Simply couldn't have been.
Oh, and Bill, that's true, because you said that your time with the CBS Studio Center, you basically had to learn every single detail, so you would have known if there was something up with it.
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, once I got into the business, 1969, I started doing a lot of research on that very idea, because I wanted to build some elaborate costumes. I wanted to see about what we could do to try to create musculature. Mm-hmm. And even back in 1980, I was bidding on the guerrilla work for Michael Crichton's novel Congo.
Oh, okay.
Michael Crichton was considering making that as a movie himself in 1980. And so I was doing research on how we could simulate muscle movement. And we even actually explored an idea called ferrofluidics, which is liquid magnetism. And NASA had been doing experiments on ferrofluidics, this liquid magnetism, as a way of using it as a mechanical device for some of the space program.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually explored that possibility, because what it is, it's a magnetized fluid. You run an electric current through it, and it becomes magnetized, and it balls up. So you could make something like an extended muscle, like a real long kind of a sausage shape, and then you run an electric current through it, and it pulls itself into a ball, like, say, a bicep muscle when you tense the bicep muscle, or the calf muscle in the leg when you really strain it, and it becomes a real powerful ball on the top of the back of the lower leg. So we were actually exploring that as a possibility to create muscle movement in suits. Didn't make it work. It was too impractical. So we never got it to a point of working in a prototype. But we were exploring those possibilities. So yeah, you can say realistically that throughout my early career, I was studying any imaginable way to try and simulate muscle movement, and there simply wasn't any, period.
You know what comes to mind is the TV show The Incredible Hulk with Bill Bixby, and when that thing would come
Right.
out, and you had basically, if I understand correctly, it's just a static prosthetic, for the muscles, but it doesn't. They don't flex.
Well, no, on the TV series, Bill Bixby played the guy when he wasn't hulky, and a bodybuilder named Lou Ferrigno played the Hulk.
Oh, okay, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, in the newer ones, they used a CGI figure for the Hulk, I think with Mark Ruffalo as the normal guy. But in the early Bill Bixby one, no, they just switched actors. They went from Bill Bixby, a normal guy, to Lou Ferrigno, who was a world-class Mr. Olympia competing bodybuilder.
Right. And he would have the the realistic-looking muscles then.
Oh, yeah, he had it for real. You just had to paint him green.
So I had a question.
But every time somebody's tried to simulate it in films, it's been a fail. They can make a suit that looks like great muscle, but as soon as they start moving around, it doesn't move like muscle. And that's a constant problem. Yeah.
Hey. So, Bill, I had a question. Because I know that in your book, you say that at first, when you saw the Patterson film, you were in college, and you were maybe intrigued by it, but you weren't a Bigfoot believer at that point. And you even say that you were more interested in the ape costumes that they did in 2001 and A Space Odyssey and Planet of the Apes and so forth.
Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
Correct.
So at what point in your career did you really sit down and look at the film and say that, oh my gosh, this is real?
It's kind of hard for me to pinpoint an exact point. I mean, yes, I knew about the Patterson film almost as soon as it came out, but you are correct. At the time, I was thinking more about the 2001 Space Odyssey ape makeups that Stuart Freeborn did, and those I thought were the most amazing thing in the world, and that's what I wanted to learn how to do. Over the years, every once in a while, I'd see a documentary on TV. They'd talk about the Patterson film, or I'd see still pictures of it, and I'd be kind of curious about it. But it wasn't actually until after I did this series of ape costumes that I mentioned for the parody of 2001 for a computer commercial. Doing those kind of made me realize a lot of what can and cannot be done in the costume. It really clarified it in my mind. And it was sometime after that, probably the early 90s, I remember I was working for a robotics company, and we were thinking of creating our own exhibits and then renting them out to museums. There were dinosaur shows that did that. Kokoro and Dynamation were two of them that would rent out these dinosaur shows. We wanted to get into that field, so I proposed a touring exhibit of cryptozoology. And we would look at all of these different creatures that are rumored, suspected, or reported to be existing based on all the areas of cryptozoology. But we were going to actually look at the technology of analyzing the claim. Right. And, of course, one of them was the examination of the Patterson-Gimlin film. So I remember going back to it and studying that in a little bit more detail. And having done that, those ape suits for the TV commercial just a few years before that, I had that background in my mind, and that's when it started to gel in my mind that this doesn't look like a costume. This doesn't do the things costumes are supposed to do. So little by little during the 90s, I was kind of exploring it informally and sort of came to a conclusion that the neck just is not a costume neck. I hadn't really had a chance to analyze the rest of the body, but the neck is the one that I focused on at the time. So by the end of the 90s, I was pretty certain it's just not a costume. But around 2008, when I actually decided to get serious into the analysis and look at all the evidence, I thought the fairest thing to do would be just to put all options back on the table and then literally see where the film evidence goes. And it went right back to absolutely real.
Right, because exactly as you say in your book, that what the studios used to call it was creature work, meaning that they would try to recreate things and so forth. But as you point out, it's just especially with the neck, there are just certain things that could not probably be done in like in a studio or something, or a costume.
Well, it couldn't be done anywhere based on the materials.
Yeah. Was there a specific frame in the Patterson film that really got your attention right away?
I don't recall any particular one. The famous look-back photo is certainly one of the most compelling because it allows you to see the face and allows you to see the torso and the breast masses on the torso. So there's no question that is forever going to be one of the most compelling images. Yeah. But once you get into it seriously, you really have to kind of look at every single one of the 954 frames, and you find different frames have the potential of revealing different things about what's going on. So you tend to lose your emphasis on one frame as being the one because you kind of look at different ones for different things.
Hey, Bill. I'm talking about the that look back. Looking at that scene, I've got one in front of me. What are your thoughts about the angle of the sun, the lighting? Was that consistent? In other words, there's no way it could have been faked as far as stage lights, or I've heard that sort of thing where maybe there was the lighting and the shadows were off a little bit.
Yeah, apparently some people, when they were analyzing the film, said, well, this had to be done on some kind of a film stage. Unfortunately, the fact that people have gone to the location and found it, I've even been there myself, that kind of blows the idea that it was done on a sound stage, because it really is a physical location and people really can't visit it. So that eliminated any question about it. But in terms of the lighting, if it were on a stage, you could actually simulate similar lighting. All you need is a 10K brute arc, which is the most powerful stage light that Hollywood commonly used. Put it up in the corner of the stage, shine that down on it, and it would create a single beam of light that's very similar to sunlight in its form. So that actually could have been done. But there is something about the lighting that definitely lends authenticity to the film. And what it is the fact that a lot of people don't realize that the sun is, of course, or sunlight is in motion. The earth is actually moving, the sun isn't. But the shadows of the sun move constantly. Now, they move fairly slowly. If you just literally stare at a bright sunlight shadow outside, you're not going to see any obvious movement. But it is actually moving, and it will move quite substantially, even in like 1 minute or 2 minutes. And I actually did some experiments with that, which are pictured in the book, showing how shadows from the sunlight shining down on a big 4x4 piece of lumber and throwing a shadow on a brick wall, how it moved literally in 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and such. So the way the shadows move, we can find certain shadows in the film that trees cast on other objects. And if the film were done in kind of a faked way, you know, you do a shot, you stop, plan the next one, talk it over, rehearse it once, then go ahead and shoot it, do the next one, and the whole filming would have taken actually, I don't know, half hour, an hour, maybe more, if it were done like that way as a hoax. But if it were done that way, these shadows caused by the trees on a certain object or form, they would have moved completely away within that amount of time. And I actually did search the Patterson film for all of these possible shadows, looking at them in different segments of the film, because the film actually has 6 parts. Roger started and stopped his camera 6 times during that filming. And so if it was stopped and then there was a lot of planning for a hoax and then it was started again, the shadows would have moved enough to be measurable in a very distinct way. But the shadows are absolutely 100% consistent with something that happened literally start to finish in no more than maybe 2 minutes.
You know, and the other thing is, I'm looking at the picture, and from a layperson, everything's equally in focus. You know, you've got trees in the background, you've got leaves in the background. Behind Patty, you know, that little kind of a ridgeway there. I just can't imagine. I mean, that'd be an awful lot of work. Seems like an impossible amount of work to do on a sound stage, even with, you know, green hats and all that stuff.
Well, it would have been at that time a couple of $100,000 worth of set dressing to try to create that as a set. Wouldn't have been cheap.
And also,
no way.
And also, Bill, I have another question. When you first saw the film, like you said, it was in college. Were you maybe not as interested in it because at that time it hadn't been stabilized? It was really kind of a shaky cam type of thing, and then later on it became stabilized, so that's how you were able to analyze it in more depth.
Yeah, when we saw it back then, we just saw it full frame and at real-time speed. So it was just some blurry, shaky thing with the camera shaking all over the place, and it just kind of walking away as some small figure that's only like 1/7 of the size of the frame even. So without still pictures blown up from the camera original, or without zoom-in slow-motion versions that were done on optical printers later on, without any of that, you just look at the first film and you think, that's interesting, but you don't really see much potential to try to get to the truth of whether it's real or fake.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the beginning, when it was presented that way, that's exactly it. You couldn't see enough to be sure.
And also, just in general, did you see anything in the film that's from Patty's hair or her fur that would be different than what you would see on a costume? Like, was there any specific detail, or is it kind of too far away to tell?
Oh, it's definitely too far away to tell.
Oh.
This is a funny thing, because another makeup artist, Rick Baker, did an interview with Geraldo Rivera, I think in '92, where he said that the fur, he thought it was fake because the fur tended to look like fake fur of the time. Now, I found that kind of curious when I heard the interview, and I don't say this with any disrespect for Rick. He's a genius, no question about it. But the simple reality is 16-millimeter film photographing a full-body figure that's only like 1/6 of the frame, there is no way that film is going to capture enough definition of the fur to be able to determine anything about its texture, its thickness, its quality, or any details about it that would allow one to make a distinction between fake fur and real fur. The resolution of the film simply will not support that conclusion.
Right.
So no, you can look at the film, but even in the close-ups, the close-up frames that are done, you can't tell enough about the film to make any conclusive distinction of yes, it's fake fur, or no, it's some kind of a real fur.
Right.
Hey, Bill, what about the creature's gait and location of the joints in the limbs, but specifically the gait? How could an actor in a suit simulate that?
Well, I know that there's other researchers who seem to think that this is a very, very important thing to investigate. I'll be honest with you, I have a lot of confidence in the ability of humans to mime unusual actions, unusual postures, unusual walks, unusual runs. So I don't see that really as being an issue. Patty's walk has been described as what's called a compliant gait. It's a walk in which you have your knees bent all the time, and you sort of glide across the ground as opposed to walking with a straight leg. But Groucho Marx perfected that very walk, that compliant gait. It was this silly little walk that he would do in some of the old Marx Brothers comedies back in the 1930s. So I personally don't subscribe to the idea that the walk, even though it's a little unusual, in any way disqualifies a person from pretending to be Patty. There's a million other wonderful good reasons to disqualify humans, but I personally have never relied on that particular one.
Right. Hey, Bill, I had a question. Because you said that you mentioned that you had been to the site of the filming. When was the last time that you've been there? Has it been in the last 10 years or?
No, I was there on July of 2012.
Oh, okay,
about 7 years ago.
Okay, because yeah, I do wonder as to the whole site again, if it's changed at all, if there's been new, obviously I heard that. Yeah.
All the open area that we see in the film is completely grown over with new growth.
Mm-hmm.
So if you stand approximately where Roger was when he was filming Patty and the Look Back, you can't see those big trees across the back wall.
Yeah.
Literally, it's impossible to see them. You have to get within about 30 or 40 feet of those trees to see them, but they are still there. When we went there, we were able to identify so many utterly unique landscape elements that absolutely are seen in the Patterson film. We were actually astonished at how many were there and still instantly recognizable. But the whole open area where Patty's walking and Roger's running, that's all grown over by new growth. And about the only way you could sort of get it back to 1967 look would be if you literally wiped out all of that new growth vegetation. And I don't know if the Forest Service would allow that.
Yeah, but no, that's a great point, because that kind of reverses the theory that, it was done in a studio. Well, no, people have actually been there. People have actually been there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, our identification, aside from the fact that John Green went there the next summer, June 68, Renee Hendon and Peter Byrne went there a couple of times, 70, 71, 72, 74. Other people went there during that time, and when they photographed it, it photographs identical to what it is today, except occasionally a tree's fallen down, so there might be one less tree, but it's the same spot. So enough people have been to it then, and plus the verifications that we did in 2012 and a few visits people have made since then, the site is 100% verified as being where the film was shot to an absolute certainty. Yeah.
Hey, Bill, going back, you said there might be some things that would disqualify a human. Can you kind of elaborate on what some of those might be?
Oh, absolutely. Number one, probably the biggest one, is the shape and size of the head. Whenever we try to make a human face look like an ape, we can't take anything away from the human face, okay? And the human face, from the eye socket and the brow ridge, the cranium basically goes straight up for 3-4 inches, and then it curves and goes backwards, okay? An ape face doesn't do that. After the eye socket and the brow ridge, the head starts sloping backward almost immediately. So we can't lop off part of the guy's brain to try to make him look like an ape. You know, he's not going to go for it. You know, it's not exactly medically sound. So we can't do that. So what we have to do is we have to try and cheat the shape of the face. We have to pull the muzzle, the nose and the mouth, way out like 4, maybe 5 inches forward of the person's real mouth. And then what we have to do is pull the brow ridge out 3/4 of an inch, maybe an inch. And then we try to slope the forehead back a little bit before it actually hits the real forehead, so it kind of looks like it's sloped back. That's the standard cheat for trying to make a human look like an ape. The problem is all of this audition makes the head much bigger. And one thing I did in my book is actually take several gorilla costumes that had been made at different times and show them and scale the body from the top of the head to the base of the buttocks, identical to Patty, and then compare the size of that gorilla head to the size of Patty's head. And in every case, the head was huge by comparison, sometimes twice as big, maybe even more than twice as big, especially with the the King Kong 2 movie that was done around 82, 83, Return of Kong or something like that. The head is absolutely huge. Patty's head is incredibly small. So we're dealing with a head that drastically differs from a human head in that the eye socket and the brow ridge are pretty much right at the top of the head, and it goes straight backwards from there. But you can't do that with a human head. It's literally impossible. The only way I could do it when I made a mask that was appropriate for Patty's head was if you put the mask on and then you tilt it so the head is almost pointing straight down at the ground to try to get your eyes in the eye socket and get the back of the head to be angled up enough to go around a person's normal brain area. But the head's literally pointing straight down, and that's not what we see in the film. So the head shape and size alone is by far and away the number one disqualifier from any idea that it's a person in a costume. The body portions are definitely very unusual for humans, and they're not cheated. Nobody did anything with a suit to try to rearrange where the body proportions appear to be, like arm extensions to try to make the arms look longer. But the arms are very long, the torso is very long, and the legs are very short. That anatomy is exceptionally unusual, and very, very few humans even have it. The breast mass on the chest of the subject has a fluidity about it that's perfectly natural for a real organic breast tissue, but almost impossible at the time for anyone to fabricate with any of the prosthetic materials that were known to exist. Those are just some of the examples. There are a lot of subtleties in the lines of the back, the folds, pouches of skin and everything in the back that are absolutely natural for a real body, but things that would never actually be incorporated or designed into a suit and could not ever happen by accident of just a person flexing or moving while wearing a suit. So you have a lot of these disqualifiers of the body that simply say this is not a costume.
Bill, that was actually one of my next questions, is that if you were designing a costume, would you intentionally maybe put fat tissue on a creature or a costume, or would that be something that you wouldn't do?
You'd only do it if it was for a comedy. and you wanted a funny, flabby creature. Yeah.
Yeah.
It could be done, but it would have to be for that intention.
Yeah.
Basically, at the time, the whole concept of monsters was that they were always powerful and they were always scary. And fatty tissue is never perceived as being, even though it's legitimate in nature, and a very powerful creature can have fatty tissue in nature, in our human culture, fat is acquainted with weakness, lack of strength, lack of muscle tone, lack of exercise, and unfortunately, not paying any disrespect to people who are obese, it's a point of comedy. It has been throughout our culture, the fat guy. And fat suits have been created for comedies for actors to wear to make them look silly and overweight. But any incorporation of any type of fatty tissue would have been done for a comedy effect, especially back then. Would never have been done for anything that wasn't a blatant, almost satirical comedy.
Yeah, and as you mentioned last week too, it may have been a case where since the film was shot in October, it's possible that she was bulking up for not hibernation necessarily, but bulking up for the winter and so forth.
Yeah, when food is scarce.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask.
Biologically, that's reasonable.
Yeah. But I want to ask you about the look back that she gives, because you notice that when she looks back, she turns her whole torso to look back at Edison as he's filming them. And I guess my question is, it's actually just common sense. I mean, if a human is in a costume and they were to look back, they wouldn't turn their whole torso, right? They would just turn their head. I mean, would a costume prohibit them from doing that, from just turning their head? Or?
At the time it would have definitely, unless there was a complete separation between the fur on the head and the fur on the torso, which we know from looking at the back is not the case. But yeah, if you had a costume where the fur on the head joined the fur on the torso, a human would not be able to turn the head more than about 30, maybe 45 degrees to one side. But Patty's got literally her head turned 90 degrees compared to the direction that she's walking in. Now, the turn of the torso would help a little, but even with that help, if she were wearing a costume with the fur on the head going in securely into the fur on the torso, she never would have been able to turn her head that far. Or the person inside would never have been able to turn their head that far, no.
Bill, I've got a question, and it doesn't have to do with the Patty film specifically, but some of the films that I've seen, and frankly, they're pretty poor quality, about people making Bigfoot films. It's the eyes. If you have a real actor wearing a Bigfoot suit, and the camera zooms in on the eyes, you're going to see the actors, the whites of the eyes, and this isn't something that you see with gorillas or chimpanzees. Is there a way to put a contact, or is there any way to take the human eye and make it get rid of the whites of the eyes and make it look a little more simian or a little more like an ape?
Oh yeah, that's a type of a contact lens called a full scleral lens. Originally, they were actually made of hard glass. And they're literally almost a half circle. And once the glass is made, it's possible for someone to actually paint any colors they want on that scleral lens, to paint the iris any size they want, paint the pupil any size they want, or they can just leave the pupil blank so the person can see out of it. They can paint the rim around the iris, and then the sclera area, which is the white of the eye. They can make it either really bloodshot, or they can make it blotchy with a lot of reddish brown, orange brown blotches in it, like a chimpanzee eye. They can do any of that on a full scleral, and they did have those. I'm not sure exactly when. I know they had them in 1975 when Rick Baker was doing King Kong back then, because he was wearing them. And at the end of the day, they had cut off the oxygen supply of his eyes. And his eyes were in absolute agony when he finally took the sclerals off at the end of the day, because his eyes were oxygen starved. He nearly went blind doing that show. But they did have full sclerals back then. That's 75. They probably had them possibly back in the time of 67, 68. But I'm not sure exactly when they were first introduced. But they could be painted in any pattern you like.
Do they restrict the actor's visibility?
If the center part is absolutely clear and optically smooth, it shouldn't have restricted their vision.
Okay. Do you think?
Yeah, I've never worn them myself. Others have, and they seem to be able to function okay with them. So it does seem like, yes, they can see through them.
So that kind of that sort of technology, excuse me, would that be available to? I mean, can just anybody, especially back in '67? Do you think anybody like Patterson?
Well, there are very, very few cosmetic lens doctors who had even the capability of manufacturing the sclerals and painting them and then fitting them. So you would have had to go to a specialist, and it wouldn't have been cheap. I don't know the exact price on the making it as well as the fittings and everything, but it wasn't some paltry sum that Roger Patterson could afford, no.
Hey, Bill, let me ask you, because I know you talk about this in the book a little bit as well, but has anybody in Hollywood ever given you flack for coming out and supporting the authenticity of the Patterson-Gimlin film?
Oh, there have been a few people who seem to strongly disagree and have criticized me on occasion. But no one's actually ever taken what I've written and criticized it point by point and said, okay, on page this, paragraph this, where you say this, you are wrong because. No one's ever analyzed it like that. The occasional criticisms are more kind of the bluff type of thing of you don't know what you're talking about, or you're practicing pseudoscience or something like that. You know, they're just vague challenges to me per se, but they never actually go point by point challenging my analysis. So far no one has.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, if people want to critique somebody, don't critique the person, look at their analysis. And I think that your analysis is really spot on in the book. And by the way, I unfortunately, I apologize. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I'm getting there. But it's really well written.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I would have to point out, this is what I always do if I'm looking at someone else's material or their writing on the subject. I will always zero in on an exact statement they say. I'll quote the page, I'll quote the paragraph, and then I'll quote the exact line they say, word for word correct. And then I will explain why that is incorrect. In my opinion, that is the proper way of challenging someone else's argument or someone else's research or a book presenting their ideas. You zero in on the exact thing, you show exactly what was said, and then you show exactly why it is incorrect. For example, David Dagling, who wrote a book called Bigfoot Express.
Yes.
In his book, he talks about the 2001 apes and the Planet of the Ape suits, and he made the mistake of saying, this is technology that didn't exist yet in the time that Patterson did his film. Well, I went back through that and said he's incorrect, and then I actually quoted him exactly what he said from the book, and then actually went into documentation showing for both of those films when were they filmed, and both of them were filmed complete before the Patterson film was done. They're just released after, but they were filmed before. And so I just showed that, no, these ape suits were the highest technology of the time when Roger Patterson shot his film.
Yeah.
Bill,
Bill,
in my opinion, that's how criticism should always properly be addressed.
Bill, that's so funny that you just mentioned that, because that's one of the quotes that I just pulled from your book that I wrote down. Because in David Degenling's book, the specific quote is, quote, in 1967, we were still a few years away from Planet of the Apes. In 2001, costumes were not very sophisticated and apparently hard to come by. And then you come back and you say, no, look at the evidence. That's incorrect.
Yeah.
And yeah,
exactly. That is how anyone should criticize someone they disagree with. No one's ever done that to a single passage of my book, which is interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Just look to the evidence, and I think that we all have to do as researchers.
That's the way it should always be done.
Yeah, we have to be skeptics. We have to take everything in context, but yeah, exactly. Take everything objectively, though, is a good lesson. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Bill. Last question of the night, and that is, it's been 52 years since the Patty film, and there still isn't conclusive proof of a hoax. Can you just give a brief summary of why you think that is? I think we covered like 99.9% of that, but if you could just, maybe just a quick summation of that.
Okay, do my best. Basically, when you analyze whether the film is a hoax or not, you have two fundamental questions, really. Was the film itself photographed in a spontaneous way, or was it filmed in a way in which there was evidence of deliberation, planning, organizing, in other words, a calm, systematic production of a hoax? Every single factor that has been analyzed and considered so far supports the idea that it was a totally spontaneous action by a person who had no control over the situation, and that it truly was filmed within a matter of 1 to 2 minutes entirely from start to finish until Roger ran out of film. It was not something where they took the time, set it all up, rehearsed it a bit, filmed segment 1, stopped, had coffee, talked about it over, then set up segment 2 and then shot that, and then thought about segment 3 and then set that up, and then reorganized to get across the creek, started doing segment 4. There's nothing in there that shows patterns of deliberation. And if you understand 16 millimeter filmmaking and you've actually worked on crews, you would know exactly what evidence to look for. And I do try to outline that extensively in the book. So the first thing is you look at the film itself and see if the film appears to truly be a spontaneous event that was filmed within a matter of a minute or two by a person who had no control over what was happening, or was it a deliberate stage production? 100% of the evidence supports spontaneous and unplanned. The second basic element of analysis then is that you look at the subject figure herself, the one we commonly call Patty. Okay, you look at her body, you look at the way it moves, you look at the way it appears from frame to frame, and then you systematically take every element of the body, the head, the neck, the shoulders, the arms, the contours of the back, the hip area, the legs, the arms, the hands, the breast area when you see her turned around. You look at every individual area and you analyze if it's a costume, could this have been done? If so, how? And then you look at the realities of real human anatomy, because Patty is much closer to a human being than she is to an ape. Her body is literally, if you took off all the fur, is almost entirely humanistic. The head is the only thing which really is sort of more ape-like. But you look at the realities of human bodies and human anatomy, and you see, does what we see here match the realities of human anatomy and ape anatomy? Yes. Does it match what costumes would do? No. And so when you're looking at Patty, that's really what it boils down to. But you have to look at it part by part, the head, the neck, the back, the hips, the legs, the arms, the breast, everything, item by item, comparing each one to the potential of costumes and the reality of humans. And once again, it comes up 100% consistent with real human or primate anatomy and 0% consistent with a costume. That's it in a nutshell.
Fellas, I hate to break this up, but we're out of time. Bill, it's been fascinating. I've been sitting here just absorbing everything you're saying, and I've got to buy your book.
Yeah, no. I just think that Bill's last quote there is a perfect summary. I mean, absolutely perfect. And yeah, definitely, his book is great too, so.
Well, Bill, it's been a real pleasure having you on for 2 episodes. You definitely have to come back, if you're willing to.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, we'll give it a rest, see if you get some feedback from your listeners and viewers, and then I'll be glad to do another. Sure.
All right, great. Well, fellas, listen, we're going to wrap up. Everyone stay tuned for the next segment. Welcome back from the break, everyone. What we did this week is very similar to what we did last week. We had, of course, Bill Munns on in last week's episode, and we had Don with us on the Q&A. If you remember, Don has a connection to the Cowman story. So since we did the second part with Bill Munns this week, we had Don come back with us for the Q&A. Don, how you doing, buddy?
Hi, Will. Doing just fine, thank you.
And, of course, Tom and Brian are here. Fellas, I know you have all of you have lots of questions, so I don't know who wants to start first, but...
Hey, well, I'll jump in.
Okay.
So we got a question, and this is actually perfect for you because of not only your background with this topic, but I understand you worked in firefighting, forest firefighting for a time. And so the question is, have you ever heard of, or have you ever seen a situation where Bigfoot has come out of the forest or has been found as a result of one of the forest fires?
Well, it didn't happen when I was fighting forest fire, but and I did it for just one summer. But I was told by the head of the cultural committee at Klamath Reservation, and this was back around 2003, that a native firefighting crew was out on a fire, and I can't remember where he said the fire was or what year, but they said one of these things, while they were sweeping the fire line, that one of these things came running out of the burning area towards them and actually through them. It fell down, got back up and took off running, smoldering, and someone cast the handprints that it left, and I guess they were on display in Klamath Falls for years. And then apparently nobody knows what happened to them. The display was gone.
Interesting. Seems to me I remember you talking something about when St. Helens erupted. You kind of had a little bit of experience there too. You weren't on the scene, but it kind of affected what you were doing at the time.
Well, not so much when St. Helens blew, but we went there in 1976. A group of us. Yeah. And we found tracks. And we were on our way to the location of where the cabin had been that the miners had, their incident in 1924. But I was in the Army when St. Helens blew. In fact, it was our unit that did a lot of the aircraft work in that area. And
that's what I was thinking about. It seems to me that didn't you say that the flight that you were on got rerouted?
Oh yeah, and, no. The morning it erupted, May 18th. We were in Yakima, had been over there and living in holes that somebody nicknamed foxholes, and I don't think they were anything like infantry would make a foxhole. Of course, we're cavalry, so we're not supposed to dig in and sit in a place very long. But we were there for 2 weeks, and I got the word that we were moving out, heading back to Fort Lewis, and so I told the guys to load up on the helicopters, and within 15-20 minutes after we took off and we're heading west, one of the pilots come across my headset and he says, "Hey Sarge, you know what that is over there?" And he's pointing. and what looked like a big cloud bank. And I'm thinking, oh, crap, it's raining on the other side of the mountains. We're going to get wet. Everything's going to turn to mud. It's going to take extra hours to clean up. And, I'm just calculating all the time before I get to go home and take a shower. And he said, no, it's St. Helens Blue. And they rerouted us, away from the ash cloud that was heading to Yakima.
Yeah. I have heard stories about experiences of them putting Sasquatch bodies basically in a hammock type thing and hoisting them up away from the scene, some that had been killed and some that had survived. And,
well, there were some stories that were concocted about that, but I can tell you about that area when it blew. If anything was killed there, it was buried under 100 feet of ash.
Yeah.
I mean, Harry Truman's house was under 100 feet of ash, so there was nothing found. I knew most of the pilots, and they knew what my quote-unquote hobby was, so they would have told me if they would have seen anything.
Yeah, good point. Well, I'm glad you said that, because I know there are a lot of stories going around about that.
Yeah, and I know some of the people that made up those stories, so when one of them started out with a guy, and I won't mention his name.
He who will remain nameless?
Yes, he tagged along with us a couple of times, and he said, and he would just conjecture things. And he said one time, one of them was about the woodpecker, and he says, well, I think, if you bang on sticks or bang sticks on trees, that's got to be how they communicate. And the other one was this nonsense about the mountain erupting. And he says, well, I would just imagine that there's got to be bodies out there when the mountain blew. And I said, look, most animals cleared out of the area before the mountain blew, including these things. And even if there was anything killed, it was buried under, many, many, many feet of ash.
I would think about the only animals that didn't have enough sense to get off the mountain when it was shaking like that were people.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think most
everything
wildlife,
else cleared out.
Most wildlife cleared out of there.
Yeah, animals have a good sense about things like that. It's like, you hear from a lot of people about before earthquakes hit, how their animals start acting up before they even know that something's happening. They have a way of, they can sense it.
Mm-hmm. Brian?
You were talking about, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Don.
Well, you were talking about Fort Lewis, and I've heard, about people having experiences with Sasquatch even on Fort Lewis and in that area, and I was wondering if you had any experiences there or if you knew any people that did.
Well, and we've talked about this a few times.
I thought so, but
I'll tell it again. In the early, from 1979 to 81, I was assigned as a squad leader with the recon platoon of Delta Troop, 3rd of the 5th Cav Air Cavalry Unit, and we were out. And this was around the time they first came out with the ANPVS-5 night vision goggles. Before that, we had the old Starlight scopes they used in Vietnam, which were awful. They worked. If it rained, you couldn't see anything. So they issued me a set, which I took my squad out, and we practiced, in pitch black, where I would wear them and lead with everybody hanging onto our web gear. The guy behind you would hang onto the back of yours, and I would lead him up and down, hills through the brush and all kinds of stuff. So we decided we were set out to do practice ambushing, and we were in an area. They split all the 4 squads up in our platoon. I don't know how many miles we were apart. A good 5 miles at least. So we weren't anywhere near close to each other, and there was nobody else out there. So we were just practicing, and I told my team leaders to go ahead and deploy their teams, the fire teams. And I took my radio man. You center yourself for command and control purposes between the 2 fire teams so you can control what's going on. And so I chose a spot in the tree line and took him in there. And then, of course, this was, I'm guessing around 10 o'clock at night. It was pitch dark. And we walked into this tree line, and this poor kid, he's got to be within arm's reach of me or the length of the cord on the radio that he's carrying so I can, use it at a moment's notice. And I walked in the tree line and I noticed I couldn't make out what was there. But whatever it was really big, and it took a step from my right to my left, one step sideways. And I can tell you instantly the hair went up in the back of my neck, and I said, get out, back up, get out. I pushed this poor PFC back through the brush, and then I rallied. I yelled at the rest of the squad to rally on me, and we were out in kind of an open, this real wide tank trail they had out there, and little used. It was more or less overgrown with grass for the most part, but it was wide between the timber on either side. So I told the guys, I said, look, I got a call. We're not going to do anything tonight. I said, just stand down, try to get some rest, get some sleep, and we'll get picked up in the morning with the helicopter. So we're sitting there. I don't know how long we were sitting there. Nobody was really talking. They were tired, after a long day of training we were doing. And then one of the guys says, Sarge, didn't you say there aren't supposed to be any aggressors out here tonight? And I said, yeah, there's nobody within many miles of us out here. He says, why can I hear somebody walking around us? I said, nah, it's got to be your imagination. And of course, I'm thinking, I don't know what that was in the brush we came up on, but I hope it's not what I think it is. and
I'm guessing you had a pretty good idea.
Yeah, I did. And a couple of the other guys piped up and they said, oh yeah, hey Sarge, we can hear sounds like somebody walking around us. A person on two legs. And
that's not what you wanted to hear.
No. Then one of the other guys says, hey, Sarge, you're from this area. What do you know about Bigfoot? So
funny you should ask.
In a unit like that, you're pretty close to your men. So I told him what I'd experienced as a teenager, and I'm sure a lot of them would swear to this day that's what was walking around us.
That might not have been the best time to share that story with them, Will.
Yeah, probably not. But you know what? we had two M60 machine guns. Everybody had an M16. We had tons and tons of blank ammo. Now, you can't do a lot with blank ammo except you can make a hell of a lot of noise, and racket. So
yep.
I figured if nothing else, we'll make a hell of a lot of noise out here, and maybe we'll drive off whatever's here.
Yeah, I'm guessing it probably would have kept them at bay.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, we acted as aggressors to other units on base. There was one time we issued, and I can't remember, I think we took the whole platoon's M60s, and we snuck up on an engineer battalion. And of course, my job as a scout was to sneak up on people and observe and gather intelligence. So I told the guys, I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to slowly move in. And these guys were noisy. They weren't paying any attention. They were out at night working, building these. They were fortifications, for like a long-term encampment, if you were going to be in combat. Something that would be very difficult to get into. So they were making a lot of noise building this thing and not paying a lick of attention to what's going on outside of their perimeter. So we very stealthily and slowly moved in. We got within, I bet less than 50 feet from where these guys were with 8 M60 machine guns. And I blew a whistle and all the machine guns cut loose. I'm pretty sure all these guys probably wet themselves. And then
I'll bet they needed a shower when it was over.
I told the guys, I said, fire for about 20 seconds and then stop. And then we silently moved away in case they decided to probe their lines, which they didn't. And we waited about an hour and did it to them again. So they didn't get a whole lot of sleep that night. But so you make a lot. There's a lot of light that comes off. Even with blanks, you get a lot of light that comes out of the end of the barrel, you have a flash suppressor and everything in there. But
a lot of muzzle flash still.
Right, even with a blank adapter, you still get a lot of that.
Yep.
So anyway, those are fun stories. But we're pretty sure that we encountered something out there. I never really heard of anybody else. I've heard of stories where people claim they have, and just outside of that area, outside the base in the town of Roy, and And beyond that, of course, we had the Clark Ranch experience. And a friend of mine had rabbit cages in the town of Roy, which isn't much of a town. If you've ever been to Roy, there's not much there. Even today, there's still not a lot there. So their house
it's still just a spot along the road.
Yeah, pretty much. So their rabbit cages, and this was probably late 1975, early 76. He said they'd heard something walking around, what they thought was somebody prowling around the house outside. And then the rabbit cages were ripped apart, and we saw it. It was a huge mess. There were rabbits torn up. Well, I shouldn't say torn up. The hair was gone off them, but the rabbits themselves were gone. Some of the rabbits were scared to death, the few that remained. And the cages were low to the ground. So whatever did this had fingers, and it reached up underneath the bottom of the cage, poked holes, grasped the corner, and ripped that heavy gauge mesh right off the bottoms.
Wow.
It was a pretty eerie sight.
Yeah, that's not something that any kind of a wild animal that I can think of would be able to do.
Yeah, his mother said, well, it had to be a dog. I'd like to know how a dog, I mean, the dog was laying on its back, and we're only talking, about 18 inches off the ground.
Yeah.
And it doesn't poke, the holes were at least an inch across, the ones that still remained. So a dog isn't going to poke a hole. I mean, it was that really heavy gauge mesh, you can get for those kind of rabbit cages with, they were 2x6 framing. So it was very heavily constructed.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but dogs don't have thumbs.
No.
So I'm not sure how they're supposed to peel that back like that, even if it had the strength.
So there were plenty of things going on, both on and off Fort Lewis in that area.
Yeah, my ex and my daughter lived in the Nisqually Valley, which isn't very far away from all that. So, I had told my daughter when they were living there, don't go out because she used to like to go for a casual stroll at night along the country roads where they lived. It's like, don't go out there walking at night. And if you insist on doing it, don't be alone. Go with somebody.
Yeah,
because,
and especially up towards Clear Lake and the Bald Hills, that was an area that had a lot of activity. I mean, there's a lot of people in that area now, but, back in those days, there wasn't.
Well, Brian, I'm sorry, but all this started, I interrupted you.
Oh, no.
You had a question of some kind.
Oh, no, that's fine. Actually, I do have another kind of follow-up question to that. Because Will, I'm sorry, you mentioned thumbs and so forth. How often is it? Because when we think of the subject of Bigfoot, we obviously think of footprints and casting and so forth, like casts. But how often is it that you've come across in your research with, fingerprints and palm prints and things like that, like with them touching on windows, actually this is also a question for Tom too, because he had a story with a car window, but also just house windows and so forth. How often is it that you get evidence from that?
It's not real often, but, I have a fair amount of stuff and things I found myself. And of course, Tom, what you found is very similar to a photograph I have from the Midwest from a friend who sent a couple of pictures. He actually sent, it was a handprint on his truck window, and then the other marking was what he thought was a nose print where, this thing put its face right up on the glass. Tom, what do you, and of course your handprint, Tom, right? Is Tom there?
Oh.
Maybe he fell asleep.
Oh, no. Sorry about that. Technology. I had the mute on.
Are we boring you, Tom?
What's that?
I said, are we boring you?
No. If I'm typing on the keyboard, I need it muted. So, but yeah, the whole story behind the handprint is it was in an area that three of us went up there. We spent a day. We hiked up to a fire lookout, and when we came back, there was this really, and I sent a picture of it to Will. There was this really odd print on the side of my truck on one of the doors. Never heard a thing. There was no indication. There was absolutely zero, no sounds, nothing to indicate these things had been there. But something had put this huge handprint on the side of my truck, and that's, most of my encounters have been that way. They just come out of nowhere.
I have a question for you, Tom. This handprint, did you notice if it was plain enough? Did you notice that the thumb was in a kind of a different spot than it would be with a person?
I'd have to go back and take a look at it.
It seems to me that from the handprints that I've seen, it looks to me like their thumb isn't quite in the same spot that ours is.
No, the hand's a little different than ours.
Yeah, Will, you sent me that handprint, the comparison of your hand with this other handprint in the mud, and they're huge. And yeah, you're right, Don. It's it's kind of in a unique position. So I'll have to go back and take a look, because I remember looking, and it's funny. It looked like it put its hand on the truck and then just swiped the two center fingers down because it was really dusty.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, just kind of like it just touched and then felt.
And Tom, I've actually found finger markings in dirt and clay that way at least a couple of times. Very similar kind of things where they'll put the finger down and sort of drag it.
Yeah, they're doing something, some tactile feedback, or what they're doing.
Will, can real quickly, can you elaborate on how their hands are different than ours a little bit?
Well, yeah, they're the fingers don't appear to be as long as ours in proportion. I was going to pull the print out,
but they have. It almost looks like they have huge palms and stubby fingers.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Exactly.
Their palms are bigger. Right?
Yeah, I'm taking a look at one of the casts that I have of a handprint at the moment, and the one time when you were talking about the picture, sorry about that, I almost knocked my cup over. Yeah, definitely the palm is fairly large. This particular hand, I think, is about a foot long from the heel of the hand to the fingertips. The fingers are wide, but they are shorter in proportion than ours are. And the thumb is in kind of a weird position. It seems to be a little lower set than ours, and the angle is kind of odd compared to ours.
Interesting. Does that show up on the Patty film, by the way? Were they able to zoom in and look at that? I
don't think the hand wasn't really open, so I don't know that they were able to really tell much in a way. I mean, we should have asked Bill what he saw, but I don't think there's really a lot in terms of detail on the handprints or the hands on that creature.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But
when you, I'm sorry, Will, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say I do have some photographs of various handprints that have been sent to me by witnesses, plus a few things that I found myself, and they're actually similar to the cast that I'm looking at the moment.
What struck me about it was, as soon as I saw it, it looks like a gorilla, like an oversized gorilla handprint.
They're actually, I've got some pictures of gorilla and chimp hands. I should send those to you so you can put them on the website. They're very different than ape hands.
Oh?
I would say they're actually closer in appearance to our hands than they are apes, but they're also very different than our hands.
Kind of somewhere in between.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, because I know what ape hands look like. We're talking gorillas and chimps. That these really don't resemble those that much.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
What struck me, there's just no getting away from. It's 1 foot in length. That's huge. It's an enormous creature.
Yeah, I was just gonna tell Will. I never paid a lot of attention, so when he said that that handprint was 12 inches, I had to go measure my hand. Everybody's always told me I have big hands, and I measured my hand and it's 7 inches. So, I mean, that's almost double the size of my hand.
Well, and it was bulky. You think about it, Will. Not only is it a big handprint, but I think about it now in context of those tree breaks that we've seen. Where it just grab and snap. That's what it would take. It would take that size of a hand with an incredible amount of force.
Yeah, absolutely. Sitting here looking at the cast, I'm thinking, oh yeah, okay. The trees that I found on numerous occasions snapped over like that 90 degrees. A hand like this certainly would be what it would take to do that. Ours are far too small for anything to do that sort of damage.
And also the construction of our hand, because it's less palm and more finger, I think the more palm probably gives them more strength in their hands.
Yeah, for sure.
Just a theory.
Yeah. Yeah, he will, just to kind of switch topics a little bit.
Sure.
I wanted to ask your opinion about this, because there was an article that was just came out, I think, last week, and it was from a Pennsylvania newspaper, and they said that, and I don't even know if they got this from the BFRO or anything like that, but they had a listing of all sightings in the last several years. And of course, you can imagine, obviously, Washington State is first, California is second. But the thing that I'm really surprised about, though, is that the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth ones were all in the Midwest, like Pennsylvania, Michigan, New York, and Ohio. And obviously, we think of Bigfoot as being, Pacific Northwest, but does that surprise you that the next four, besides Washington and California, would be in the Midwest?
Well, that's there are quite a few sightings that happen in those places, but we got to remember when you see things, information like that, it depends on who compiles the information. And I don't think there's anyone that has a real comprehensive listing from everywhere, not just in the country, but on the continent. So is that accurate? Probably not, just because, there isn't enough information. Information's only as good as what's put into it.
Right. But there are definitely sightings in the Midwest and
East. Absolutely.
Including, which surprised me when I started looking into all this, how many sightings there are in the Texas Panhandle and into Oklahoma and that area. Mm-hmm. Because you always think of mountainous forest regions, and that's not always true.
Oh no, they're adapted to many types of environments.
Yeah, I was surprised too, the sheer volume in Texas and New Mexico, Oklahoma.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common misconception with a lot of people that they're found mostly in forests, and that's like I was talking about when I lived in Montana. I thought when I lived over there that there certainly wouldn't be anything like that there, and surprise, surprise.
I was just thinking that. Yeah, surprise.
Yeah. Hey, well, this is a question for you. Do you think that it's well, obviously it's possible, but do you think that it's maybe frequent for some of them to maybe start out in the Pacific Northwest and then make their way over to the East Coast and settle there?
Well, there's some that move around, but a lot of these are already in those locations because we have, the various varieties of them, and that only happens over long periods of time with them adapting to an area, not really breeding outside of that area.
That's true, because I've heard people theorize that as the country was settled and people moved west, that most of them were driven to the west coast. But
I don't think so. I think they were already there. I think they stayed in those areas, albeit small numbers, but they were already there and stayed there.
Yeah, that doesn't really ring true because, as you explained, they the way they are different in different parts of the country has to happen over a lot of years and a lot of generations.
Yeah, it's not going to happen in just a couple hundred years. We're talking a long, long time period.
Right. So that kind of blows the whole migration, getting pushed to the west coast there, right out of the water.
Exactly.
I got a question though. Well, you and I talked about context, and this ties in with what we're talking about right now. In an area, you look at the context or the history of a specific area, and I think you've said this over and over again. You take a look at it, and some areas they just are there. We even mentioned up in Washington, some areas up there where they're consistently seen. And I wonder if you could comment on, like for example, when houses and dwellings and that sort of thing, people encroach on those areas. Sometimes it seems like it doesn't push these creatures out, as long as they've got enough cover. Have you seen that? And do you think, if like neighborhoods and that sort of thing, moving into an area that's been historically a hotspot, maybe for centuries, they're not going to necessarily just go away.
No, I mean, it does disrupt their patterns, their behaviors, but they adjust. And, they may not be able to go completely into the area they had for maybe generations, as a feeding area since it's gone, with neighborhoods and things, but that doesn't mean they're not going to attempt and come up to the edges of, the new build-up areas. And we hear that time and time again from people.
Yeah, right. There's some areas, in Oregon that I've heard where I was surprised. There's a lot of activity, and they're in populated areas. Now, they're rural areas, and there's a pretty good green belt for these things to move in and out of.
I think
you're doing this.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say that I think a lot of that goes to the theory that, or what Will has said before, and I think it's very true, that the way that man has changed over the past 50, 60 years, when my dad was a kid, as Will stated, people hunted for food a lot more back then, and it was kind of if it moves, shoot it type of an attitude, because people needed to bring home meat to feed the family. And it's not like that anymore. And because of that, you see bear, coyote, and all kinds of different animals getting closer and closer to people. And I don't think that Sasquatch are any different. I think that we're seeing a lot more encroachment by them too, because they don't have as much to worry about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Matter of fact, one of the grammar schools in our area has been having an ongoing issue with bobcats just showing up inside. Wild bobcats coming up and showing up inside the schoolrooms.
Oh wow!
Now they're not going to hurt anything. It's a bobcat. I don't.
Yeah.
Bobcat attack, but it's just interesting that they're, this is happening.
If I was a kid in grade school and saw a bobcat, I'd have thought that was pretty cool. But I wanted to get back to something you were talking about, the handprint that when you came back and found that handprint. I don't know how you felt, but that would have creeped me out.
I stared at it. The other two people were dyed in the wool, not quite at the debunker level, but certainly at the just under no circumstances do these things exist. So I didn't really bring it up with them. But I just stared at it. Everybody's getting it.
Yeah.
I just kept looking at this thing, and
that would have given me the willies.
What's that?
Tom, I actually have a question, and also maybe a follow-up question to Will, and also to Don and you. But out of curiosity, what were the weather conditions of that day? I mean, did it possibly rain earlier?
Yeah, that's a real good question, Brian. No, it was, excuse me, that day was bright and sunny, but it was 30 degrees outside. It was really, really cold, but it was very dry. The humidity was low, and the truck, see, the road going up there is an unpaved road. It's basically gravel. It's a typical Forest Service fire access road. And these roads kick up a lot of dust. Will, you know what I'm talking about, right? When you drive these back roads into
yeah.
Yeah. they really,
Yeah.
and so the truck was covered with dust. So it was a perfect, perfect medium for this thing to put its hand on and leave a really nice print.
And especially in that kind of weather, because when it's cold out and warm in your vehicle, you're going to have moisture building up on the windows like it does on a cold glass of water or something. And, and then the dust just sticks to it.
Yeah. Oh, and it did. Yeah, it really did.
Yeah, because that does make me wonder that if you had conditions like that where it rained, there might be a lot more evidence out there that we can see. But a lot of it depends on weather. And also, kind of a follow-up question to Will is that with footprints, how different are the footprints that you find with conditions where it may be rainy and soggy, so the footprints really stay in there, versus the conditions where it might be dry, and so you might have a footprint, but it doesn't look the same.
Well, let me mention something about the handprint too. You guys were talking about, how the print would show up. There'd be dust on the car first, and then the print. I have photographs of the reverse of that, where a gentleman I know sent me these hand and fingerprints on his car, and they didn't know they were on there until they got home because of all that dust that was kicked up. Apparently the prints were left on the back of the car, on the glass, and the dust that accumulated during this drive home made the prints show up.
So the oil from its skin was on the glass.
Apparently,
okay,
so yeah.
Hang on, that's a really good point, because when I washed my truck, I ran it through the car wash, and the prints, must have been an incredibly oily hand, because the print stayed on there to some extent, even after running it through when, those car washes are, it's a lot of soap and high pressure water. It stayed on there after one of those car washes.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
As far as footprints, it really depends. I mean, obviously, if the ground is wet, you're probably, and depending on the material they're made in, the chances of getting a much clearer print are better. But it depends. I mean, it just all depends on what they're made in.
Well, another question to that point, though, is that in absolutely dry conditions where it hasn't rained, and let's just take like a coyote or a wildcat or something like that. Are they likely to leave any prints at all? And you compare that to a Sasquatch.
Mm-hmm.
They'll definitely leave prints because of their weight, right?
In most cases, again, it depends on what they're walking on. And I'll tell you something, though. I would look at some areas you look at and you might not see anything. And areas like near creeks and rivers where there's the sand that accumulates around those types of bodies of water. I remember finding tracks one time about 15 years ago, and this was on the Klamath River, and I didn't see the prints at first because they were in the sand, not very deep. There wasn't a real deep area of sedimentation there, but I happened to look from a different angle, and the way the sun was, there wasn't any shadowing. It was directly overhead, so if anybody going by there would have never seen the prints because they just vanished in those light conditions. It was only looking at it from a different angle that I actually saw the prints, and they were very good prints in this river sand, but they just didn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
So you really have to look at areas. You got to really scrutinize things carefully, because sometimes things are there that won't show up unless you look at them under the right conditions. And it used to be
the angle of the sun might even make a difference.
And that holds true with even photographing prints. I know the old timers in this subject told me about this, and I had to practice it myself. Sometimes you wait in a spot for maybe a couple hours for the exactly the right light and shadow conditions to make that print really show up well in a photograph.
Well, that's exactly correct. The footprints that I found at that area, by that stump that you and I had discussed, I could see them clearly, and I knew it was kind of iffy. The angle of the sun was kind of straight down on them, so they didn't come through that great. So one thing I thought in the future, if I go looking for them, is to have a high-powered light so that I can shine it from a side angle to sort of accent.
Right, create the shadows.
Yeah, right.
That was something that I was taught a long time ago, was when you think in terms of a photograph, of course, we used to have to do it with film, so you were limited on the amount of pictures you could take, whereas it's different today, of course, with digital. You can take hundreds of photographs and not have to worry about it, unless you're out of space in your memory card. But always take a picture the way you would want to see it if you weren't the one taking the photograph. You know what I mean? How would you present that to somebody so they can see exactly what you're seeing with the right amount of light and shadow and things like that?
Right.
When I did see those footprints, we saw them, and then we were kind of motivated to get out of there.
Yeah, that might do that.
Motivated, yeah.
Yeah, if we were sort of, situational awareness was on a scale of 1 to 10, it was about a 7 before. It hit about a 12 as soon as we saw those footprints.
Adrenaline will do that.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, Will, I have another question too, and this doesn't just apply to Bigfoot, but maybe all animals out there in general.
Mm-hmm.
How aware are they of their footprints? In other words, they know that they're probably leaving footprints. Are they conscientious of that, or?
Well, it's hard to tell because, and I know there are people out there listening, and probably some will say, "Oh, absolutely." Some know. You get a whole range of opinions. The fact is, we really don't know. Now, if they're a hominid, which is the same thing we are, doesn't mean they're a human. They're a hominid. They're of the same general family grouping. Different species, obviously, but if they're in our family grouping, highly intelligent, they could very well be aware of their footprints. And
right.
And to that extent, it is possible they could be conscious and avoid making them in certain places.
Right, because I think that if you're being hunted, you would want to avoid your predators, and so. And I'm not saying that deer are that necessarily intelligent, but maybe they are. But
think
maybe
think of it in these terms. When you're in a forested area, a lot of times predators will leave their scat sort of marking their territory, their hunting area. If a bigger predator comes in, it'll defecate on the smaller predator's scat, basically saying, "No, this is my area." So if animals are aware
of that happen.
Yeah, if animals are aware of their scat like that, then it's certainly possible. And I can tell you with the Sasquatch, I found this to be true in places where they were hunting, where there was a lot of scat throughout the general region. And region, I mean by, there was an area, it was about 35 square miles we were taking a good look at one year, and lots of Bigfoot scat. In one of the lower areas along a creek, there wasn't any. And I thought to myself, well, if you're an animal this size, you don't want to burn up a lot of calories just aimlessly wandering around through forest. Especially through forest, it takes a lot of energy to move through a setting like that. It's a lot of work.
Yep.
How would you do it? To maintain, it's a mathematical equation. You need to have more calories coming in than going out to be able to survive. So in order to do that, you have to conserve that energy. So you do it by being an ambush predator. And when that thought dawned on me, I started looking inside the tree line, and sure enough, within 20 feet there inside the tree line there was all kinds of this scat in there, and they were concealing it so that the prey animals coming along the game trails wouldn't know they were there. So if they're conscious about scat, then they're probably conscious about footprints as well.
And that goes into your whole point, though, too, about context.
Yes.
In other words, whereas most investigators would not even think of that. It's almost like you're a detective.
Well,
there.
yeah. I think you have to be.
Yeah. Interesting.
That brings to mind something that I wanted to toss at you guys. That kind of goes to the same point of reasoning and awareness in animals, especially in Sasquatch. You had a guest, Greg from Kentucky, who was telling a story from years ago that his mother told him. And when they saw a Sasquatch from across the road, his mother's sister screamed, and immediately the Sasquatch froze, and it stood there for almost 5 minutes looking at them, and it didn't move. And I couldn't help but wonder about that. I think that it's instinct for them immediately when they're aware of people being near them to freeze in their spot, because as a general rule, people, if they're standing still, especially in a wooded area, people aren't going to see them.
Yeah, that's true. And they're kind of designed for that sort of camouflage because of their upright posture.
Yeah. So I think that it did that for a while and then realized, hey, wait a minute, they're still seeing me, and it had to move on.
I'll tell you a story that's good when we talk about this, a larger context of a situation. I knew an old gentleman in the town of Carson by the name of Datus Perry back in late 80s and early 90s. And I was introduced to him by a friend of mine in Portland, and it was kind of important that I didn't know who he was at the time, but I needed a contact because I was quite a ways away from Vancouver, and I was trying to cover, that whole region, Clark and Skamania counties and the surrounding areas. So it's very important when you're covering a large area to have contacts throughout the region. If something happens, you get notified. The sooner the better. So he was telling me about an encounter he claimed he had in Alaska years and years before, and he said, I saw this thing, and he actually made a mock-up, a life-size mock-up that was 8 feet tall. It was made out of plywood, and he had fur on it. It was jet black. And when we went to meet him, he actually had it out by his mailbox. It's sort of a welcome to me. He said he made a big deal that a real Bigfoot hunter was coming to see him. So anyway, he was telling me this story, and I'm listening, and it kind of the same thing about it. He said he watched it for about 20 minutes and it never moved, and it had this big, real sharply pointed head, and I'm kind of, I'm on the verge of a red flag or two, but I'm listening, and thinking, well, maybe there's something I didn't know here. But listening to the more information he had about the trip, and putting this larger context together, I sort of lost it when he said he was paddling a canoe, and he paddled it up a waterfall. I kind of lost credibility in him at that point.
Unless you're the $6 million man, I don't think that's going to happen.
No, probably not. Nice old man, but he never really had any information that was of any value. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
But you have to look at these bigger context. You have to look at the context of a whole situation. All the surrounding information, and instead of just the details of a story.
Right.
That's a good point.
Paddling a canoe up a water. Yeah. Okay, that's the end of that conversation.
And he was kind of a fun old guy sometimes, but he did crazy things. One time, I think I told you guys a long time ago that my friend Carlo, and Carlo had to be a PhD. He was a brilliant man, very highly educated, but would never talk much about himself. He just wasn't that kind of person. Super nice guy. So he would get a call from Datus, and we would drive all the way out there. And I think, I can't remember what the distance is out there from Vancouver to Carson, but it's a long drive. So we would drive all the way out there, and Datus always insisted on us riding with him. And we had this old Rambler station wagon. I mean old. Datus, when we met him, I think was 85 and pretty spry. And I think the car had to be about as old as him. It looked like it anyway. And he had this old Ford van, and there was no seats in it except the two in the front, and it was full of tools and junk. So we would have to ride in the back of the van, sitting on the floor with all of this stuff, and he would drive at breakneck speeds around all these forest roads through the mountains, and we just knew we were going to be killed at any time. Go careening off these cliffs.
Little or no regard to the fact that somebody's in the back of the van with all those tools rolling and bouncing around.
Bouncing all over the place and just, trying to hold on for dear life.
Yeah, it's not just that you're back there bouncing around, but with all that stuff bouncing around with you, it's not really a comfortable situation to be in.
I've seen people where they promote Datus. Of course, Datus has passed away a long time ago, but they try to put him on the pedestal of being a Bigfoot researcher and all this stuff. And nice old guy. I like Datus, but he was crazy as hell and really didn't have anything to offer on the subject.
Hey, well,
sorry to digress there. It was a funny story, so I had to tell it.
Well,
that's a good story.
You're in the back of that truck, you got Pro Joes potentially flying around, tools and screwdrivers.
And he exactly, and he was driving as fast as he physically could up and down these roads that were horrible in condition anyway. You can't imagine unless you experience it. There's no theme park ride that would scare you more than that ride in that van.
It sounds like a ride with a typical Montana rancher on his back roads. They're all like that. And they'll tell you, oh, it's a good road, great road, no problem. And good Lord, a covered wagon would barely make it where they're going.
Right.
And here they are doing 50 miles an hour and, bouncing all over the place.
And as he's driving along, he's got these really thick glasses. You couldn't see that well, and he was mumbling under his breath the whole time. So I don't know if I'm painting this picture clear enough.
That brings to mind the old saying, there are no atheists in foxholes. I'll bet you were back there speaking to somebody.
People ask me if I'm afraid of the Sasquatch, and not after riding with Datus Perry a few times.
It's a life-altering experience.
I don't fear anything anymore.
If I survived that.
And it's not because...
There's a silver lining in every cloud there.
It's not because... I don't have fear. It's because my nerves are dead. They were killed.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. You probably don't have any adrenaline left after that.
He would go up there, and there was that whole area, Skamania County, south of Mount St. Helens, is covered. It's honeycombed with lava tubes. And most of them, nobody knows where they are because they're out in the forest. But Datus, it was sort of his hobby to go find these things, and he'd take his wife with him, and had a couple little dogs. And some of these now, they weren't just tubes in the ground like caves. Sometimes these were layered. In other words, imagine one lava tube and then another one underneath that, and then yet another one underneath that. And he would find ways to get down to the lowest levels, and didn't really have any equipment to be doing this. I mean, the guy could have been buried alive in any one of those, or lost and never found his way out.
There's a guy that's got a YouTube channel who's talked about that. He focuses on the missing people up in the state of Washington. And there's, I can't think of, you probably know, maybe it's the Gifford Pinchot, is that what it is? There's a national forest up there.
The Gifford Pinchot, yeah.
Okay, Gifford Pinchot National Forest. And I think there's a huge area that is these lava tubes.
Oh, yeah.
And so this guy's walking along, and all of a sudden the ground just drops by 2 feet.
I'll tell you something. We were up there, my buddy Jack, just north of Carson. There are huge areas of blueberries, wild blueberries, and huckleberries for miles. And he wanted to take his 2 young boys up one time and pick a bunch of them. They wanted to make a pie or something. So I tagged along, thinking I'm going to get a little look at the area. And, you never know when you're going to see something up there. And we were walking along through these big patches of these berry bushes. And all of a sudden I came up to a hole that was probably 3 feet across. And it was just black. And we got a flashlight. And we didn't know we were on top of one of these big lava tubes that was probably 20 feet across, and part of the ceiling had fallen away. I mean, literally, you could fall in one of those, and if it's closed off on either end, you'd never get out of there because they're round, and you wouldn't be able to climb out.
It'd be an abyss.
And nobody would hear you. I mean, I'm sure that thing has probably happened.
Well, that was what this guy was speculating. He heard when it dropped down a couple feet, he heard some of the rocks underneath, that had been dislodged. And it took them he figured about 2 seconds before they hit the bottom. So you do speed, time, distance calculations. I think he came up with about a 60-foot cavern.
Yeah, Datus took us to one time where, probably a football field length of one of these tubes had collapsed. The whole thing had collapsed. And it was old because grass was growing over, but it was this big U shape in the ground. It was probably, that thing had to have been between 60 and 100 feet across. It was enormous. And I thought, oh my God, if you were in one of these things and the roof collapsed, they'd never find you.
Oh yeah. Well, and for those who aren't familiar with this kind of lava, excuse me, it's right up there with walking on coral. I mean, it's just sharp.
It's rough, yeah.
Yeah.
We got a little off topic with some of these things, but interesting stuff anyway. But, in those areas, I mean, sure, people could vanish that way or, and of course, we don't know what or if the Sasquatches use these things. I've never seen any evidence of it, but it doesn't mean they wouldn't.
Yeah, I would think it'd be a rough existence in those lava tubes. You never know.
And, one thing about those lava tubes is oftentimes they're wet inside. They're cold and wet, so... And there's ice caves up there also.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and like you said, they're not really stable because you constantly got moss and you got little microorganisms going in there breaking down the stone. Mm-hmm. And eventually that's why, like you said, it collapses or somebody walks on it or
earthquakes, things like that.
Yeah. If it collapses under our weight, now this is an interesting thought. How is it going to do under 8 to 1,500 pounds of weight? Think about
exactly,
that.
Sure.
Could just whoop.
Oh, yeah. And it's in berry fields. I mean, they're going to be going through there, so hard telling.
Yeah, wouldn't that be interesting to find the remains of one of these creatures? And
did we have any more questions, fellas? We're getting kind of close to the time, but
I've got one from Fred Siebert.
Okay,
and I just like to give him some priority because
and hello, Fred. From those us here at Creek Devil and your wonderful class.
Yeah, and this is just he's thanking us for putting Piper's question on the air a couple weeks ago, and another student has 2 questions, and so here they are. Question number 1 is, Will, when you're at a sighting and you find hair, has it ever come back as a new species? So it sounds like he's assuming there's that you do testing or something on it.
No. With hair, at this point, they can't do a great deal with it. I mean, there's some things they can do, but there's not enough information available in the systems that are existing to compare to. I mean, they kind of have to have, especially with DNA, they have to have a known sample to compare it to. We have a lot of that with humans. Of course, we study mostly about ourselves. And then certain animal species we do a lot of study of, so there's things to compare there. But with these creatures, at this point, there's not a great deal we can do with it. But there hasn't been anything determined based on hair.
Okay.
And I know some people out there might claim that there is, but there really isn't.
Yeah. Got to wait till we catch one. So here's the other question. It's he wants to know, or he or she, I'm not sure who, has there ever been a sighting where the event, let me rephrase this. Has there ever been a sighting, I'm assuming where he's seeing the event, a sighting event, where the person who saw it doesn't know what they saw or what had happened because they were in such a state of shock?
Yes, absolutely. I've been contacted by quite a few people over the years who wanted me to help them make sense of what it was they saw or encountered. And sometimes, there's so much disbelief that a person will, it just really kind of shakes them to their core. So, there's a lot of confusion. And especially if they're so far removed, let's say from the animal kingdom, just not into things outdoorsy or in nature. And we have people like that, of course, who are very urbanized. And, then it really throws them for a loop when they encounter something like that. So, yeah, absolutely.
And Will, just to interject, that's exactly why we're going to try to have a psychologist on here.
Yes.
Because that would really explain, I think, a lot of that question. That's a great question.
Yeah, and for anybody listening who is a fully qualified psychologist, we're looking for somebody not necessarily to talk Bigfoot, but, there are a lot of things about the human mind and our reactions that we'd like to have a professional discuss.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have to be this topic at all. So, if anybody out there is interested in talking about things, and we have some very generalized questions, and again, not Bigfoot related, but just so people understand, how the human mind works in various situations and so forth, please contact us.
Yeah, that'd be great. I just want to follow up here. Fred says, thanks. Our students love the show, and they really appreciate that it's a family-friendly show. So
we try for the most part to watch our language. So if there's occasionally, and I know occasionally, word does sneak in here and there, so please forgive us for that. We try to keep it clean.
Hey, Will, if you just have 2 more minutes, I have
no problem.
I have one final question. In terms of trail cams, because obviously, as you have shown and stated that, and correctly, that they are not comfortable with things that are not natural to their environment.
And especially man-made objects.
Exactly. So do you think that with trail cams, when they see them, do they just smash them, or do they just kind of avoid them for the most part?
Well, I think for the most part they avoid them. I have heard a few times where people claim they were smashed, but there's no way to know exactly what did the smashing. Because it could be bear, it could be lots of things. It could be other people. But for the most part, they avoid them.
Right.
And not just cameras, but anything that's man-made. If it's put in their environment, they're going to avoid it.
That's a great question. Do you think there is a way to create a camera? Because this is on my mind, and I'm sure everybody out there wants to know. Would there be a way to conceal one of these cameras or create a distraction in such a way that these creatures would not notice it?
Well, it can be tried, but, it's sort of a crapshoot, if it would work.
Yeah.
Don, you have anything else for us? I think we lost Don.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Well, fellas, anything else? Oh, yeah, he texted me. It was something I said. Okay. Well, Don, we'll have you back on sometime. I'll message him here in a moment when we're finished. But, yeah, we lost the connection. So, fellas, anything final thoughts before we wrap up?
I just want to say I do have a few more questions here, and we will put those on the next Q&A. So I want to thank everybody for the questions. Keep them coming. Everybody has excellent questions. And again, you can just reach us questions at creekdevil.com or encounters@creekdevil.com.
Yeah, the next Q&A should be interesting. We're going to have Joe in Texas on with us, and he's bringing a witness that, from what he says, has a very interesting bits of information to tell us. So we're kind of looking forward to that.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Oh, go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
No, I just said, yeah, I was agreeing. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, fellas, well, listen. We'll wrap this up for this session, and everyone, we're going to take a break. Stay tuned for Jim's readings.
Welcome. This is a 5-story collection being brought to you by William Jevning and being narrated by me, Jim Sower. Story number 1. The Creature from the Avalanche. What did Tony Woolridge see and photograph standing in the melting snow on a Himalayan mountainside? Was it, at last, a Yeti? Woolridge himself thinks so. He told his story to David Helton, who reports herein, and showed his pictures to 2 experts, who deliver their contrasting judgments. BBC Wildlife Magazine, September 1986. When in early March of this year, Tony Woolridge first saw fresh animal tracks on the slopes of the snow on either side of him, the thought of a Yeti did briefly cross his mind, but only as a funny idea. He was, of course, in the same general part of the western Himalayas where, in 1937, H.W. Tillman followed a set of large, ape-like footprints for more than a mile, and where, in 1976, Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker emerged from their tent on a morning after a night disturbed by unidentifiable low growls to discover that whatever the thing was that had kept them awake, it had apparently, and this may have been what the growling was about, scoffed 36 Mars bars, complete with wrappers, before wandering off ahead of a wake of tracks very much like the ones Tillman had found. Other mountaineers had also had food go missing in this neighborhood, and Woolridge, who was the first person to have passed through this valley since the autumn snows, was vaguely aware of such stories. Nevertheless, if there is anything that always happens to someone else, it is an encounter with a legendary animal, and after a quick smile at the Yeti idea, Woolridge forgot it. There are lots of interesting sights to be seen in these mountains, and the last thing you need to do up here, especially if you are alone, is to fantasize. Unlike most Westerners who come to the Himalayas, Woolridge was not a trekker, or a tourist, or a climber. He was there as a charity fundraiser. In ordinary life, he is a physicist who does research and development for the CEGB in Manchester, United Kingdom, and he has been on walking and climbing trips to the Alps and the Andes, but on this occasion he was on a 200-mile sponsored solo run for an organization called Tradecraft, which promotes trade, intermediate technology, and fair play and conditions in third-world countries, including India. He was staying mainly in the 1,800-meter-high town of Joshimath, northeast of Delhi, and not far from the Tibetan and Nepalese borders, and was ranging out from there in different directions through the high valleys over a day or 2 or 3 days. Each day he would set himself a goal and try to run to it in time to run back either to Joshimath or to another outlying base before nightfall. It was 11 o'clock on the morning of the 5th day out when he saw the footprints. He had run from Govindghat, the village north of Joshimath, to a couple of empty bungalows known as Ganjaria, and was now trying to reach the closed end of the highest valley he'd gone through so far, about 4,000 meters. At 3,300 meters he saw the footprints, and was struck by their clarity, smiled at the idea of a Yeti, and then wondered what really might have left them. I thought it was probably some sort of large langur monkey, because there were a lot of them about, lower down. Between Govindghat and Ganjaria, there were a lot of colonies of them, and I do remember reassuring myself that it didn't look like a big cat. Snow leopards are the only thing I had been told were in the area. But of course, a person could spend a good part of his life actively searching for and never even glimpsing a snow leopard. Peter Mathiasen wrote a very good book, Snow Leopard, about his and George Schaler's Himalayan snow leopard expedition, during which, almost incidentally, they failed to get a single reliable sighting. To be afraid of an attack by a snow leopard, even granting that you could believe that such an animal would ever consider tangling with a man, would be impossible, if only because anybody who was ever killed by one would almost certainly go straight to paradise. A bear? I was under the impression that there weren't any bears around here. Anyway, there weren't any claws in the prints. He had also seen a wildlife notice earlier. The whole region is a national park, and it hadn't mentioned bears. In fact, there probably are bears in the area. Asian black bears are reckoned to range throughout the Himalayas, and brown bears are also occasionally reported. But the footprints did not look like a bear's, and that was that. They did not have paw-like symmetry. He could tell that much, even though he did not stand around for a long time gazing at them. He considered a few more possibilities, but nothing seemed quite right. From a medium distance, he took a couple of pictures. I had a long way to go to get up to where I had to get back down that day, so I didn't hang about too long. My main concern was with the instability of the snow, because it was so warm that day, and the surface was rapidly getting softer. I realized that the longer I left it, the harder work it was going to be. The next thing that happened, as he half ran, half plodded onward through the wet snow, was that a bird of prey with a 6-foot wingspan came in very low and took a particular interest in him. Woolridge is not a naturalist and had no idea what kind of bird it was, although, having looked at a field guide since then, he thinks it might have been a griffon vulture. But what had begun as a fascinating close look at a large specimen of mountain avifauna gradually changed character as the bird continued to spiral down at him. I thought, does it think I'm injured or something? I was obviously going very slowly over the open slopes, and although I had an ice axe with me, I just couldn't afford to take the risk that it might harm me in some way. So finally I shouted at it, and fortunately it disappeared off to the other side of the hillside. If it seems odd that anyone, naturalist or not, could actually expect that a vulture would harm a human, they are big creatures, and so are we, and it takes an animal the size of a tiger to prey on us. Remember that Woolridge had also had a long thought about snow leopards, even though he knew how rare they are, and then remembered that he was all alone up here. Anything that happened to prevent him from returning on time to base, a broken bone, for example, could, at the very least, occasion an expensive search party, and that, at the very least, could prevent the whole reason for his Himalayan run. As for the most that could happen, that was just about anything that could be imagined. This was not unreasonable fear. It was an extremely mind-concentrating sort of responsibility. Then, a little further on, it was about noon by now, he heard a crash, and what he describes as a long rumbling. My first reaction was that an awful avalanche somewhere, and then I thought, no, it can't be, because nowhere around could I see any sign of any snow movement. Maybe I was trying to rationalize it to myself. I don't know. I put it down to soldiers in the valley dynamiting for roads. He pressed on up the slope, which seemed suddenly to get much steeper. It was also as the sun was shining on it, getting warmer and making Woolridge very nervous. And then, sure enough, stretching across his path was the sweep of debris of a freshly fallen avalanche. I think now, with hindsight, that this was the noise I heard. I went across the next 50 yards or so to get to another spot where the slope evened out so I could get a good view of it and try to work out where it started, what had started it, and what the risks were of something else happening. The thing that really caught my eye was this great big smooth slide in the snow, as if some pretty heavy rock had slid down it. But there was no rock. Where the rock should have been, or where signs that the rock had bounced away should have been, there was nothing, except tracks leading away right from the base of the snowslide across the slope behind a little shrub and beyond it. And right behind the shrub was a shape that couldn't have been a rock. In an unpublished written account of the incident, Woolridge describes this shape as a dark, hairy creature, perhaps up to 2 meters in height, standing erect on 2 legs. It had a squarish head and long, powerfully built torso. In talking about it, he also mentions knee-length arms with brown hair on them. Edward W. Cronin, in his book, Erin, The Natural History of the World's Deepest Valley, compiles all of the remarkably consistent recent eyewitness accounts of the Yeti into this description. Its body is stocky, ape-like in shape, with a distinctly human quality to it, in contrast to that of a bear. It stands 5.5 to 6 feet tall and is covered with short, coarse hair, reddish-brown to black in color, sometimes with white patches on the chest. The hair is the longest on the shoulders. The face is hairless and rather flat. The jaw is robust. The teeth are quite large, though fangs are not present, and the mouth is wide. The shape of the head is conical, with a pointed crown. The arms are long, reaching almost to the knees. The shoulders are heavy and hunched. There is no tail. Except for the shape of the head, and it may only have looked flat because it was lowered as the animal peered down the slope, Woolridge's description is a good match for Cronin's composite, something that Woolridge was unaware of before he took off for a run through the Himalayas. He had never thought much about Yetis, one way or the other, and if pressed, would probably have opted for skepticism. I remember how quickly I had to revise my own beliefs. I had to go from the point where I thought, well, a lot of people have been saying there are these strange footprints and there's got to be some explanation for them, the level at which I knew about these things, to thinking, well, the Yeti must exist because the creature can't be anything else that I know of. It's not a human being, and it's not like any other animal that I've ever heard of. What else can it be? It's a tremendous feeling that having all your doubts and your opinions so shaken into line. Unlike many people who see or claim to see unrecorded by science creatures, even unlike many people who have adventured to wherever they are for the specific purpose of finding and photographing them, Woolridge happened to have both a camera with him and the presence of mind to raise it and snap the shutter. The focus was right, and the lens cap was off. In fact, it was a camera with an automatic focus and a lens cap shutter lock, something that ought to be attached by handcuff to every member of the International Society of Cryptozoology. The only problem was the Yeti was standing about 150 meters away on the other side of a non-negotiable avalanche slide, And one thing that Woolridge didn't have with him was a telephoto lens. He had 35mm. The sun was behind the animal. When the film was eventually developed, the image was a silhouette about 2 meters high. I took a couple of quick photographs because I was certain that whatever it was wasn't going to hang around for very long. But it was still there. So I moved up and got as close as I safely could on the snow. I picked out a spot where some rocks were sticking out, and I was on reasonably solid ground, and I started taking some more photographs. And the longer I was there, the more I felt convinced that the animal was in no hurry at all to move off. It was remarkably stationary. It showed virtually no sign of movement. So I studied it as far as I could and took the best photographs I could, mostly from this rocky area. Then I went back down again to where I had taken the first few and took some more from there. He took a roll of color film and loaded another. The animal remained still. The only sign of movement I saw the bush vibrate on one occasion, and when I moved lower down, I got the impression, no more than that it changed its posture and was looking around the other side of the shrub. And you get that impression, too, from the negatives. Woolridge's eyes, there being 2 of them with fairly high resolution, were doing a better job than the camera. I could get the 3-dimensional effect. He could see the brown arms clearly, and what was most clear, I think, were the features of the head. The fact that it was so square, for one thing. One other thing that still puzzles me is why it didn't seem to be looking directly at me. It was looking down the slope. I was convinced the more I looked at it that it thought its best chance. Well, I don't know how it thought it could have concealed. By instinct, maybe, in order to conceal itself, it freezes. On the other hand, maybe a snow-wise animal that has just been nearly killed in an avalanche knows how to keep another pile of snow from crashing down on it. Maybe it knows to go on to the nearest bush, hang on and stay still until the snow refreezes. Maybe it was wishing that the human over there wouldn't keep jumping around and taking pictures. Or maybe not. All speculation's welcome. About 45 minutes passed. The sky began to darken, and it started to snow. Woolridge admits that all things being equal, he might have considered trying the rather dangerous crossing of the avalanche debris and continuing for a little while with his run. He hadn't reached the day's goal, Hemkund, at the valley's cul-de-sac. But that would have meant recrossing the debris later, and the snow would have been even more unstable, and it also would have meant... And this was the factor that went furthest towards making all things unequal. Trotting nonchalantly past a yeti, an animal that in some of the stories can fell a yak with a single blow, all in all, it seemed a good time to call it a day. On the way down, he saw more tracks on the slopes below, but they were distant and inaccessible, and the light was getting worse. He took 5 or 6 photos that, when eventually developed, came out black. As he passed the footprints he had seen originally, he took some close-ups, but 3 hours had passed and the prints were no longer distinct. After administering the monster hunter's time-worn self-kick, he descended towards Gangjarya, the village of the Pulna, and finally Joshimath. At first he thought he would spill the beans down at Pulna and tell everybody what he had seen, and then come back up the next day maybe and see what evidence there was. But he decided against that, partly because he was concerned about the animal. If the locals, and especially the soldiers down at Joshimath, decided to set off looking for it, well, you never know what they could have done. And secondly, The weather was turning bad, so he knew that by the next day the footprints would have been snowed over, and provided the animal hadn't been injured, it would have got well away over the col. So there wouldn't have been actually anything to see. He was pretty convinced of that. So I decided to keep the whole thing to myself, to go on and finish the run as if nothing had happened. It was very, very difficult for me because I was bursting to tell. But he kept his secret as he ran through the mountains for several more days, covered his 200 miles, and raised 2,300 pounds for tradecraft, 1,300 over his goal. In fact, he more or less kept the secret for 4 more months. Of course, he had the film developed and took the pictures around to people who had seen or failed to see evidence of Yetis, respectively. For example, John Hunt and Chris Bonington. He talked to Dr. Myra Shackley, archaeologist and longtime Yeti enthusiast, and to Dr. Brian Bertram, curator of mammals at London Zoo. He talked to other zoologists, anthropologists, and mountaineers, all of whom, he says, seemed fascinated. But he didn't go public, as it were, until he appeared with Chris Bonington on BBC One's Wild Britain in July. 4 months seemed plenty of time for the Yeti to have escaped its avalanche and to have returned to that untraceable place where all the Yetis live. But mightn't the news now still set off an expedition? I am very concerned that people should think carefully about whether it's really necessary. One of the natural reactions, I think, among scientists is to say, to be positive about identifying what it is, and in order to find out what we need to do to protect it, we've got to capture one. But it seems to me that in this technological age, we've got such a lot of ways of studying with remote cameras and image intensifiers at night, that sort of thing. I'm not at all sure that it is necessary to capture the animal, particularly one like this, which seems to have been coexisting with man for thousands of years. We don't know how many there are. They certainly can't exist in large numbers, and maybe just taking one out of the population might be enough to destabilize it. He says that he is reporting his experience now, and that he had always intended to report it at some point, so that people take stories of footprints and of other sightings more seriously, and so that the Indian government, perhaps with the help of the World Wildlife Fund, might consider this enough evidence to give the animal protection. In his written account, he ends with a quote from Tillman's book, Mount Everest, 1938. When the dust of conflict had settled, the abominable snowman survived to pursue his evasive, mysterious, terrifying existence, as unruffled as the snow he treads, and unmoved as the mountains in which he dwells, uncaught, unspecified, but not without honor. Copyright from BBC Wildlife Magazine, September 1986 issue. This is the end of the first story. Story number 2. Field and Stream, January 2000. Print Pro says Bigfoot may exist. Eerily similar tracks are found miles and years apart. Police officer and forensic primate print expert Jimmy Chilcutt of Conroe, Texas, and Dr. Jeff Meldrum, an anatomy and anthropology professor at Idaho State University, share a passion. They examine the prints left by hands and feet to reveal the identity of unseen visitors. But while the testimony of fingerprint expert Chilcutt can prove a person guilty in a court of law, Meldrum's assertions that certain footprints constitute evidence of the legendary Bigfoot's existence raises eyebrows of scientist colleagues. Meldrum hopes some skeptics will change their minds after hearing what Chilcott has to say about the footprint castings Meldrum has collected from the Pacific Northwest. The ridge detail finger pattern on the cast is neither man nor ape, says Chilcott. Is it possible to have faked it? Sure, but the faker would have had to have an intimate knowledge of primate footprints, and that didn't exist at the time the castings were made. Chilcott initiated the study of primate fingerprints in the mid-1990s, working on a hunch, the identifying ridge patterns, the articles, loops, and whorls, made by folds in the skin, would someday help forensic specialists catch criminals. He explains that it would be helpful if criminologists could identify the race of a person by his fingerprints. But research in that direction has been inconclusive, Chilcott believes, because the races have interbred so much. Primates, however, have undiluted gene pools. To date, Chilcott has more than 1,000 fingerprints of lemurs, monkeys, and apes in his computer databank. When he heard about Bigfoot castings in Meldrum's laboratory, he was intrigued but skeptical. What I do is catch bad guys in Conroe, Texas, Chilcott says. I didn't care one way or the other if Bigfoot existed. But a casting made near Walla Walla, Washington in 1984 piqued his interest. Not only did the ridge pattern run vertically along the edges of the foot, then angle across underneath the toes, a pattern different from humans and apes, which have ridges running horizontally and at an angle across the footpad, respectively, but the imprints showed splits in the feet where the ridges did not realign perfectly when the skin had healed. Chilcott got a second jolt when he found a Northern California casting made in 1967. The pattern was similar to that on the Walla Walla casting, although made from a smaller animal. For them to be fake, Chilcott believes the same person would have had to fabricate both footprints 17 years and several hundred miles apart. That seemed unlikely to Chilcott, especially after he tried to duplicate the casting and failed. The fingerprints expert has become a believer. I can assure you, he says, there's an animal up in the Pacific Northwest that we have never seen. Keith McCafferty, copyright Field and Stream Magazine. That's the end of story number 2. Story number 3. Mount St. Helens, Ape Cave. Ape Cave in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest went unnoticed for about 2,000 years. Then, in 1951, Larry Johnson of Amboy, Washington, was logging in the area when he discovered the entrance to the Lava Tube Cave, which was at the time almost completely blocked with vegetation and timber growth. Johnson then related the find to the Harry Reese family, and they investigated and explored what is now known as Ape Cave. Why is it called Ape Cave? Well, Harry Reese was a scoutmaster of a Boy Scout troop called the Apes, so named because of their interest in the legend of Mount St. Helens and its Native American tales of Old Sasquatch. Thus, the cave they explored in those years was tagged Ape Cave, after the scout troop of that day. Contrary to a published Bigfoot book, the 1924 Fred Beck story in Ape Canyon was not the motivation for the naming of the 1951 Ape Cave. The canyon story was on the other side of the Mammoth Mountain from Ape Cave. The scouts were influenced by the Native Americans and their campfire stories, which did not include Fred Beck, but rather focused on native encounters with what they perceived as the mountain's hairy apes in the 1950s. There are no stories to support the notion that Sasquatches ever inhabited Ape Cave. The cave itself was formed 2,000 years ago. What is now a cave was once a stream bed. An eruption from the mountain's summit filled the gully with lava, which did not harden consistently. As the outward part of the flow cooled and hardened, the inner strand kept moving out the bottom of the cave. The lava flowed for 3 to 6 months, resulting in the cave as we know it today. At 12,810 feet, it is the longest such formation in North America. Walls average 30 feet thick. The forest grew up and over the main entrance until it was discovered by Lawrence Larry Johnson in 1951. In a roundabout way, it was indeed named after the legendary Sasquatch by way of a Boy Scout troop named the Apes. According to Native American legend, those apes were the elusive Sasquatch. This is the end of story number 3. Story number 4. Surgeon teams with filmmaker to find Almasty. Newspaper, The Long Beach Press Telegram. Article titled, Big Hunt for Bigfoot's Kin. Published Sunday, March 29, 1992, Associated Press. A spirited 72-year-old doctor and a filmmaker are teaming up for a summer expedition to track the Almasty, or snowman of the Caucasus, a huge, hairy beast with glowing red eyes, the hominid cousin of Yeti and Bigfoot. Dr. Jean-Marie Kaufman, a French-Russian surgeon, mountaineer, and scholar, has been on the Almasty Trail for more than 2 decades and has collected more than 500 accounts and a plaster-cast footprint of the forest man of the Caucasus. She traveled on horseback through the remote mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas, talking to villagers who had seen the mysterious beast. Although skeptical at first, she became convinced that the Almasty was another in an array of species that roamed the Caucasian wilds. Retiring in France on a tiny Soviet pension, she never dreamed that one day she'd have the money to mount a full-scale scientific search. But then she had not counted on Sylvain Palax. Palax, a documentary filmmaker, was fascinated by 2 articles Kaufman wrote for Archaeologia magazine. Tracking her down, he proposed finding sponsors for an expedition that he would film. The respected French paleoanthropologist Yves Coppens gave the search his blessing. Palax raised half of the needed $1.8 million. He's confident he'll find the rest. For 3 weeks, the telephone has been ringing off the hook, said Palax, whose previous works have included a documentary on a Harley-Davidson meet in South Dakota and one on Calvados moonshiners. People are fascinated by the Almasty. A dozen people will leave Paris in June to be joined by a dozen of Kaufman's scientific colleagues from Moscow. They will conduct the research in the Kabardin-Balkar region of Russia, just north of Georgia. The expedition hopes to find the beast, put it to sleep, take blood and skin samples and a plaster cast of the face, and then let it awake in freedom after putting on a band so its wanderings can be followed. Appearing like a cross between an ape and a Neanderthal, the Almasty reputedly can run up to 37 miles an hour. It is said to be omnivorous and sometimes travels with companions and babies. The last sighting of the Almasty was by a zoologist friend of Kaufman, who reported spending 6 minutes watching one on August 25, 1991. That's the end of story number 4. Story number 5. Argosy Magazine, April 1969. Wisconsin's Abominable Snowman, by Ivan T. Sanderson, Science Editor. Argosy investigates a startling report of a dozen reliable witnesses and finds these remarkable tracks. My question was addressed to 6 of the men seated around the microphone, and it was deliberately somewhat vague. It was, "Gentlemen, before we get down to the facts, I want each of you who were on the hunt to tell me, one at a time, what you first thought this creature was when you spotted it." Richard and Pete Vanderberg, Bob Perry, Dick Blyer, Bill Mallow, and Dick Tilloch took their time in answering, But all their answers were legitimate because they gave me their first impressions first and then their efforts at rationalizing. For 3 of those present, it was a second encounter, which I did not discover until later. These 3 are local men and were hunting in the same swamp known as the Deltox Marsh, in which they, in company with 9 others, encountered the creature again on a deer drive on November 30th. All 3 spontaneously said that their first impression was one of complete incomprehension. They didn't know what it was. Bob Perry, who was up in a tree scanning the huge swamp with its stands of trees and meandering tongues of bushes and scrub, saw it first and had it under observation at the closest range and for the longest time. He said his second impression, when he had recovered from his initial surprise, was that it was a lone hunter dressed in a very silly way. Both Dick Blyer and Bill Mallow, having seen it from the ground, and much less clearly, due to the patches of bushes, could only give their rather long accounts of their first attempt at rationalization, and during this both thought it might be a bear, but, they added, they had immediately changed this to some crazy hunter, or more like an ape. By the time of the deer drive, 6 weeks later, these 3 had all come to the conclusion that it was not a bear because of its very long legs and the speed and silence with which it moved, which our black bear cannot do when standing upright, nor a hunter. This puzzled me, especially because the other 3 present, who had seen it only once on the drive, all said that their first impression had been of a bear standing upright. But when it sort of danced around and then got in behind the bushes, as Dick Tellick put it, their second thoughts also were that it was a man. When it came to third and subsequent thoughts, all 6 reached the conclusion that it was neither bear nor man, and they debated the possibilities for us around the microphone. Finally, they came up with a combined notion, approved by all present, that it was some kind of a man that behaved like an ape, and more particularly like a chimpanzee. This, of course, prompted my next and most obvious question. You mean a man wearing a monkey suit, putting on a sort of act? There was a guffaw from everybody at the table except my traveling companion, Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans, of the Royal Institute of National Sciences of Belgium, who has spent a lifetime tracking down reported but as yet uncaught animals. Joining most heartily in this explosion was Larry McKevitt, a police officer and local game warden who had actually supervised the drive. Accompanying this outburst were cries of, "It would have been suicide!" Somewhat taken aback, and asking what this was all about, I got the answer, "You don't know the hunters who come up here in the deer season," and it's the truth. Anybody who dressed himself up in a monkey suit and then danced around in the open in front of a line of even Anybody who dressed themselves up in a monkey suit and then danced around in the open in front of a line of even local hunters, giving his famous imitation of a dancing bear or a distraught escaped ape, could only be intent on suicide. Not even an escapee from a city on his first hunt would wear his wife's fur coat or a furry parka. 12 men made a drive through this Deltox marsh, moving abreast at about 20 paces apart. The game warden was out to observe the start of the drive, just to check out the hunters and see that all was legal and in order, but he remained on one of the roads that surrounded the swamp. He did not see the creature, and he had gone elsewhere by the time the party came out at the other end of the swamp about 3 miles away. This swamp, some 4 by 2 miles in extent, is surrounded by farmlands dotted with numerous woods, thickets, and marshes, which are overgrown with 3 to 4 foot tall canary grass. There are 2 large spring-filled dew ponds, locally called fountains, in this swamp, one to the north, one to the near center. In addition to the 6 men already named, there were on the drive Kurt Kruger, Artie Telek, Lester Zulhike, Don Scania, Romy Scanvin, and a visitor from Milwaukee. An interesting point is that their ages ranged from 12 to 55, and 3 of them have been in the armed forces. All saw the thing at the same time, though some closer than others, and some for a longer time. Holdaln Savina and Artie Telek got too dim a sight of it to comment. Shortly after entering the more open grass field center area of the swamp, the 3 on the left suddenly spotted something black standing in the grass, which reached only about halfway up its thighs. They didn't shoot. It was manlike. Confused, they called the line to a halt and passed the word along. The creature then began to walk to their left. Moving forward as quietly as possible, they wheeled around and got very close to it. The creature then began to retreat, but when they stopped, it stopped. And when they moved back, it came toward them. It finally moved into the thickets in the direction of some woodland to the northwest. They tried to follow, but the brush was too thick, so they circled around as fast as they could with a view to heading it off or to be waiting for it to emerge on the road beyond, on which, incidentally, they had left their cars. There they watched for a considerable time, but it did not appear. The composite description of the creature that emerged was that of a large and powerfully built man covered with short, very dark brown or black hair, and, as invariably in descriptions of these creatures, with a lighter and hairless face and hairless palms. The head appeared smallish, also with short hair, but the neck appeared to be enormous and so short as to be almost non-existent. The shoulders were very wide and large, and the torso barrel-shaped. In a 6-way discussion at our interview, some time was spent on the proportionate length of the arms, body, and legs. Analyzing this exchange from the tape, it seems that while the body seemed to be very long, this was due to the absence of any noticeable waist. All of them said that it tapered from the shoulders right to the hips. As for a description of the legs, they could only guess, since the creature was standing in grass which they estimated to be between 3 and 4 feet tall. Some at first said the legs were short, others that they were long, but this was before they decided that they should speak of their length in proportion to the body rather than in comparison to a man or an ape. Then they all agreed that they would be of about average length for a tall man, since the grass did not reach to the crotch. But it was concerning the arms that all seemed agreed, feeling that they were exceptionally long for a man. I can vouch for these young men's honesty, their sincerity, and exceptional intelligence, because we gave them a pretty thorough and skillful interrogation. Bernard Heuvelmans was once nicknamed the Sherlock Holmes of zoology on his French TV science series. Trained zoologists can set some deadly traps for non-zoologists. This may be summarized. First, they agreed. It did not seem to be afraid, and they felt sure it had seen them from the outset. Its movements were almost leisurely, and it seemed to deliberately come out from behind the bushes several times to observe them. Altogether it impressed them, as it had done the 3 previously in October, as being distinctly curious and even inquisitive and rather bold in its approach to them, though duly cautious in that it retreated before them and kept at a safe distance. Of its body motions they had much to say. It walked just like a man, but slightly forward and with a sort of swinging motion of the arms. On more than one occasion it seemed deliberately to try to attract their attention by sort of jumping around. Now, all this, and a tremendous amount of further hints and details contained in our taped record. on analysis adds up to but one thing: a hominid. This means something on the human branch of the general anthropoid tree rather than on that of the apes or pongids. In view of the fact that there never have been any wild apes in North America, and that they are very valuable specimens in zoos, circuses, and laboratories, that if one got away, it would be immediately reported, and also because it is very doubtful that any known ape could survive in Wisconsin into the fall. This leaves us with only two alternatives. Either it was a deranged person in a monkey suit attempting suicide, or it was one of the half-dozen or so kinds of man creatures that we call collectively ABSMs, abominable snowmen. Finally, it came as a considerable surprise to us to learn during the interview I describe above that this particular specimen, or one just like it, was seen on no less than 5 occasions in that immediate area last fall. Sometime in the early fall, a Mr. Freeman encountered just the same thing in an area known as the Lebanon Swamp. Perry, Flyer, and Mallow ran into it on the 19th of November. There was this drive on the 30th of November, and the very next night, a Mr. and Mrs. Stan Pencala almost ran into it on one of the nearby roads. Then, as we were concluding our interview, 4 young local men came in to say that some youngsters had just led them to 2 long trails of tracks in the fresh but slightly crusted snow, again adjacent to the Deltox Marsh. I'm afraid that this development seemed too pat. We went to see the tracks, and they displayed some very dubious features that would have been puzzling enough if they had been found on the top of the Himalayas. But by this I mean they looked more than suspiciously man-made, in that they were enormous individually, but had exactly the same stride as my own, while both sets either appeared out of deep wood into which we had not the time or means at night to follow them back to their point of origin, or started from a blacktop road and cut across open fields to another thick wood. Also, on one occasion, they stepped over a waist-high barbed wire fence without missing the snow or leaving any hairs. But perhaps we went to look at these tracks in too skeptical a mood, and our appraisal may have been prejudiced. Copyright Argosy Magazine, Ivan Sanderson. Sanderson, Ivan Terence, 1911 through 1973. Sanderson received degrees with honors in geology, zoology, and botany, and headed 6 expeditions in all parts of the world for such groups as the British Museum, Cambridge and London universities, the Linnean Societies of London, and the Chicago Natural History Museum. He was the author of many books. One, Animal Treasures, was a Book of the Month selection in 1937. Others include The Hairy Primitives of Ancient Europe, 1967, Caribbean Treasure, Animals Nobody Knows, Living Treasure, Animal Tales, How to Know American Mammals, The Monkey Kingdom, and Living Mammals of the World. The Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life, written in 1961, and countless articles for various publications and Argosy magazine, where he was science editor. This concludes the reading of the 5 stories. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.